If you're interested in what's going on in Alaskan politics, then you're going to want to give this a listen. Let's start things off with a riddle. What do Alaskan State Representative David Eastman, a roundabout on Bogard, and Mary Fulp, the 2022 Alaska Principal of the Year, who was involuntarily committed, quote, by mistake, all have in common? Well, keep listening and you're going to find out. But for any of that to make sense, we're going to have to start at the beginning. This is the true story of David Eastman and the reality of Alaskan politics in our time. You see, back in 2016, there was an incumbent Republican in what was then District 10 in the Mat-Su Valley running for re-election by the name of Wes Keller. Now, Wes was a fine man, and to many with only a surface-level understanding of the state's politics, seemingly a conservative man. The fact is, the conservative voters of District 10 like to vote in representatives who think like they do. Unfortunately, Wes, 20 years spent swimming through the Juneau swamp, took its toll. By the end of his career, which turned out to be 2016, his time in Juneau had not done him well. And more often than not, he could be counted upon to vote how the establishment wanted him to vote, even when his own voters and constituents disapproved. Well, what you'd think was bound to happen next, despite it so often unfortunately not happening in such situations when it should, actually did happen in 2016. Wes Keller was put out to pasture, where he belonged, by the sort of new, idealistic principled blood that the voters felt would do a better job of representing them. Wes Keller was primaried by a heroic and courageous man, a family man, a man of faith, first-generation Eagle Scout, a veteran, an Army captain, a West Point graduate, and a firefighter by the name of David Eastman. By the time it came to the general election, David received a monumental 75% of the vote, truly a landslide victory. Now, I don't remember everything about that campaign, but a few things stick to mind. David campaigned on staying true to the expectations and the principles of the voters who entrusted him to represent their views, preferences, and interests in the Alaskan Juneau legislative body. Not only that, but he campaigned on fixing some problems that were plaguing the local community too. Problems that not a single soul in Juneau gave two figs about. Because, simply put, money directed to real projects that help real people in politics is money not directed to benefit the private interests of establishment power brokers the way most politicians do. And heck, you gotta admit, that's how those big shots like it, and that politics functions nowadays, which is to say that the honest politician who serves his constituents is punished and the corrupt who sell them out are rewarded. Has been proven and shown to be true by the game theoretic study of politics as detailed in the academically rigorous text, The Logic of Political Survival, and the more, shall we say, publicly accessible Dictator's Handbook. If you're learning more about that, by the way, I highly recommend you check out CGP Gray's excellent overview of these concepts on YouTube in the video titled Rules for Rulers. So, what kind of project are we talking about here? Those of you who lived in the area or traveled through Bogard at the time know that the traffic situation was an absolute mess for years. Cars were regularly backed up for miles, and everyone was asking, when is this going to be fixed? People knew not to take Bogard unless absolutely necessary. And for those for whom it was necessary, they knew to leave early and fill up their car with plenty of gas. The fact is, it wasn't fixed, and it wasn't getting fixed because almost no one cared about those people who lived there. The people who lived around that area weren't big donors, and they didn't show their faces at cocktail parties in Juneau or Anchorage. They're what the establishment in this state likes to call valley trash, of which I am a proud member myself. Now, I said almost no one cared because someone did. David Eastman campaigned on getting a badly needed roundabout put in on Bogard, and sure enough, very shortly after he won his general election, work began on a roundabout on Bogard. And to this day, whenever I'm driving down Bogard and I see how free of backed up traffic it is today, I think about David and how he kept his word for us regular people. And not for the first time either. In fact, in the original version of the Alaska Policy Forum legislator scorecard, which didn't grade on a curve, David was ranked first. But now consider this, not just by a little bit. In fact, the difference between David's score and the second rank was greater than the difference between the second rank and the 60th, which is to say, last place. As a result of this making other legislators look so bad by comparison, the entire grading formula was scrapped and graded by a curve thereafter. Not only that, but he is the only legislator who had to run a race in 2022 and win a trial that did not accept special interest donations, because he is especially interested in the welfare of his voters. Now, here's a thought for you folks. Is it more in the interest of the constituents for their representatives to vote for bad legislation that harms their interests purely so their rep can say they get along with others, or that they were sent to Juneau to, quote, get things done? Or is it more in the interest of the people who sent the representatives to Juneau in the first place for their rep to vote against bad legislation when bad legislation is up for a vote, even when it enrages those other legislators who bow to the whims of the lobbyists and the pressures of corrupt interests because of how bad it makes them look to their constituents in comparison? Is voting yes on bad bills and policy that's harmful to the average Alaskan really getting things done at all? Or, when faced with that choice, isn't it true that voting no on bad legislation is closer to getting things done than voting yes on legislation that harms the voters just because you want the media, or elite donors, or the corrupt Juneau class to like you and help you advance your career? That's one of the tragic things I've learned watching Alaska politics all these years, and that's that far too often the currency which pays for political advancement in this state comes in the form of selling out the voters for personal reward. Oh, yes, no doubt about it. There probably isn't a single, faster way for a representative to become enemy number one of the corrupt political establishment than by thinking about their own constituents when they vote, instead of what makes the swamp creatures happy. Well, with David winning by such a crushing margin, quickly acting on behalf of his voters to fulfill his campaign promise of getting the badly needed roundabout into Bogard, and consistently voting upon principle, which so often also involve voting against bad legislation, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to guess what happened next. Manufactured scandal after manufactured scandal, and yet also re-election after re-election, every one of them by a majority of the vote, and none of that by accident. A lot of hate gets thrown David's way, and propaganda today works a lot like it always has. The fact is, most people only have a few sources of information, and a lot of them, like I used to myself once upon a time, simply believe that what gets reported is all there is to report, and that's the whole story. Now, if that were true, you might read an article that says dozens of West Point graduates all signed a statement condemning fellow West Point graduate David Eastman. Ooh, sounds bad, doesn't it? Well, if you're stuck in your echo chamber and trust that the news sources you choose tell you all the information, then you would have no idea that over 700 fellow West Point graduates came out in support of David. Yet again, listening to only establishment sources would have had you believe that David was doomed to be expelled from the legislature by trial. So many overconfident predictions to that effect were put out as propaganda to demoralize David's supporters and convince the public not to come out and vote for him. Yet, he still won a majority of the vote in the first round, despite competing against two other so-called Republicans. And then he went on to win his trial, exactly the opposite of what the leftist media in the state predicted would happen. You see, that's how the narrative that the corrupt establishment wants set gets set. They tell you that any outlet, the Alaska Watchman, the Federalist, or even Fox News, only contains dangerous misinformation, and it is for your own benefit, ha ha ha, that you should stay away from them. On top of that, the so-called reporters, people certainly not worth being called journalists, know that their careers depend upon pleasing their bosses, and most importantly of all, gaining access to powerful people for exclusive stories that give them a leg up on the competition. And believe you me, the moment the reporting is not written in a way that makes average Joe reporter's boss happy, and more importantly, the friends of average Joe reporter's boss happy, that access is gone faster than you can say CNN. This dynamic right here, which is to say, David putting voters first, making the corrupt look bad by not jumping into the swamp with them, and the controlled media's one sided, biased, misleading reporting at the behest of their masters, who now have it out for that rep who dares think of constituents, explains at least 90% of all the trumped up and manufactured controversies thrown David's way and broadcast in the media. But now we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Since you've got the background, let's go over those supposed controversies and the most popular arguments against David one by one. And just so you don't think David is all and only controversy, after we finish this up, you'll see where David's heart really is by looking at some of the bills he has introduced. And yes, despite the propaganda about him being impossible to work with, some of the bills he has co-sponsored as well. Many people understandably think that where there's smoke, there's fire, and ask themselves, could all the hate thrown David's way really have no cause? Well, the hate thrown his way definitely has a cause, but that fire, so to speak, that fire is the crux of the issue. Yes, there is smoke and there is fire, but the fire is not what you've been told. The real fire is caused by David's principled loyalty to his constituents, as shown by what he votes against and the bills he sponsors. And the smoke blown everywhere by the media is done so in such a way as to confuse and obscure the real nature of the fire. Now, I've already given some examples of media smoke blowing and obfuscation, like the West Point grad support and the false predictions of David's political demise. But now we're going to cover those so-called controversies made hay of by the media one by one to show you how they fit this paradigm. And in place of the propaganda, David's true motivations will be revealed. And then, just so you know that I'm not saying this corrupt system exists just to pick on David, we'll take a look at how it operates with others, like Mary Fault, Alaska Principal of the Year for 2022, cruelly and unjustly committed, force-fed psychotropic medications she didn't need, against her wishes, who had only one representative in the Alaska legislature speak on her behalf before it was revealed that the police and the courts, who have apologized, made at best a terrible mistake. I'll let you know who that single rep was, but I'm betting you can guess. After that, as said before, we'll look at the sort of things David supports, putting to rest the total straw man applied to David that you can't just vote no on everything. Yeah, no kidding. Good thing that doesn't apply to David, huh? Finally, the video will end on the note of what's going on today, how the Alaska legislature is breaking its own rules once again to single out that last bastion of independent resistance in the legislature by summarily firing half his staff as retaliation for his refusal to agree to vote yes for a budget that hasn't even been proposed yet and thus may contain the bad and harmful legislation David is so known for opposing on behalf of his voters. We'll cover the recent censuring and a general call to action with helpful resources and information for the motivated to get further involved will be provided. Now, let's get to these, quote, controversies. As we know, David began his first term as rep in January 2017. We also know he immediately got to work fighting for the little people by getting the promised and much needed roundabout put in on Bogart. That, my friends, was strike one. By April of the very same year, David was confronted with some badly written bills that simply didn't make sense, and that he was free to oppose, and oppose he did. For example, David was presented with a bill that honored a particular group of veterans based upon their ethnicity, more than once, in fact. David, though not happy with passing legislation based upon ethnicity, understood that bills intended to nominally honor the sacrifices made by veterans were coming from the right place. With the Hmong bill, David sought to remove the ethnicity language and make it about the particular time period referenced in the bill, the Vietnam War. Doing that keeps specific ethnicities out of state law, important in a colorblind society, though yes, it is well known today that woke culture embraces actual racism to the contrary. When one looks into honoring Vietnam era groups, you also find that there was another group who was also funded by the CIA, fought the communists with American support and promises, and suffered and were killed and imprisoned for doing so. Not in Cambodia, but in Cuba. By any objective standard, they deserved recognition in the bill as well. As such, David attempted to add an amendment which included other groups for honoring in the same bill, such as the bill which honored Hmong soldiers in the Vietnam War, which David attempted to amend by adding praise for the anti-communist Cubans who fought Castro in the 60s, just as the Hmong fought against the communists in Vietnam during the same era, and also attempted to amend to avoid opening the can of worms that is introducing language pertaining to specific ethnicities into state law. One of David's many principled stands is that he has sought to never place into state law a reference to a particular race or ethnicity. Showing a completely ignored real willingness to compromise, the legislative chamber would have none of it. To this day, this vote, along with others, with no context provided and with false motivations asserted and attributed to David, is used as an example to call David a fascist, a racist, or any other ist you can think of. What did David say about this vote? I quote, "As a state, we recognize by law that Alaskans and residents of our state from every ethnicity are valuable and important, and their sacrifices are very important." End quote. Unfortunately, by this point in time, after watching David campaign and win as a real conservative and witnessing firsthand his total lack of enthusiasm for jumping into the swamp, preferring instead to focus on putting his constituents first, David's amendment was rejected, and so he voted against a bill that frankly should have been much better. Likewise, in April, a bill was put forward to honor specifically, based upon skin color, the black soldiers who gave their lives working on the Alaskan highway, singling out those particular veterans without ever having honored any other veterans who also gave their lives working on the highway. And that bill was premature and wrong, and frankly served to divide the bond that exists amongst veterans that is far stronger than skin color anyway. Once again, refusing to alter the bill, to improve the bill according to David's suggestions, he voted against a bad bill that could have and should have been better. David is known for his consistency, and he consistently opposes introducing language about ethnicity into state law. If David were in fact a racist, you'd expect him to take every opportunity to act against individuals and causes pertaining to people from ethnic backgrounds different from his own. Conversely, if he were not, and instead had a reasonable and principled position regarding introducing language pertaining to specific ethnicities into state law, then you would expect to see instances where David interacted positively with individuals and groups with backgrounds different from his own when such interactions did not involve introducing language about specific ethnicities into state law. And guess what? We have some pretty powerful examples of that, and you will be hearing more about those soon later on in this video. From his co-sponsorship of House Resolution 6, supporting the National Native American Veterans Memorial, something he could support on principle as it did not introduce ethnically centric language into state law, to his singular support for the only black legislator in the House to be sworn in so she could participate in a vote for the temporary speaker in 2019, Sharon Jackson, who had the whole rest of the House vote against her swearing in, following an objection from then Democrat House Majority Leader Chris Tuck. But back to the issue at hand. Quoting KTVA, "The Wasilla Republican argues veterans should be honored equally regardless of race." Seriously, people, does that sound like racism? Or does that sound like the opposite of racism? Yet, the headlines that most people see, according to the dynamic already described here earlier, is Eastman votes against honoring Hmong. Eastman votes against honoring black soldiers. Therefore, Eastman is racist. That's the smoke. But the real fire is his loyalty to his constituents and a commitment to excellence in his work. You might say, well, that's not how I would have voted, but that's fine. Reasonable people are free to disagree reasonably without having to mischaracterize motivations and spread slanderous misinformation about political enemies. Perhaps you don't have the same stance as David regarding introducing ethnicity specific language into the state law. Sincere people engaging in good faith who feel that way would leave it to debating the merits of that particular issue. And it is precisely the loud and intentional mischaracterization of political opposition, which has clearly expressed non racist motivations on the one hand, and the flagrant flaunting of their own supposed but in reality non existent principles on the other, that reveals the swamp establishment in Juneau to be the craven and cynical media game players that they are. Indeed, this pattern of manipulative, power-hungry politicians allying with deceptive media outlets to frame the character of courageous and principled opposition such as David Eastman in a way that stands in total contrast to reality in order to bias the perspectives of the average person and voter for the sake of their own money and power is a theme that can be seen in every single supposed David-related controversy as soon as you begin to look into them, and a theme that runs through and is pointed out in this video. For those of you watching and listening to this now, if any of this surprises you, I want to make one thing very clear. The people who spread this anti-Eastman misinformation want to deceive you. That is their entire goal. They seek to deceive you because they feel it benefits their own politics, and especially the interests of their corrupt benefactors, to isolate and make an example out of all those who stick with principle and vote their conscience. The story of David's supposed controversies is actually a footnote in comparison to what they reveal, which is the pattern of how the swamp establishment and their media allies bully and intimidate legislators into selling out their constituents, with a threat and occasional example of manipulating an only partially engaged public into turning against any legislators who dare to resist or think independently. It is really quite simple. Point to something the public can see, such as a vote or a statement, remove it from context, attribute false motivations to it, refrain from including statements that would disprove the falsely attributed motivations, and presto, a significant portion of the observing population comes to uncritically accept and believe the spin and unwittingly serve the people working most against their actual interests. For those who have never been fortunate enough to be a constituent of David's, standing by his constituents and his principles, often alone, as was the case with his support for Sharon Jackson, is precisely what is meant when he is praised for his steadfastness and courage. David isn't far right, only right so far, and the careerist Juneau swamp creatures aren't moderates looking to, quote, get things done, but rather, in reality, they are loyal lapdogs who accept agendas handed down from on high uncritically, as we very tragically see today with the Alaska Senate Majority Uniparty and its binding caucus, and the bipartisan caucus in the House, which requires agreement to vote for a budget which no legislator has laid eyes upon. Such rules are effectively collective suicide pacts, designed to enable the very worst of theft and abuse of power to slip through by spreading culpability and making it impossible to remove all those responsible. Now let me ask you, do you think politics would benefit from a greater emphasis upon higher standards and accountability, or submission to lower standards out of cowardice and fear of being called bad names? And are you beginning to notice a pattern yet? Well, if you haven't yet, don't worry. We're just getting started. Let's consider some more manipulated controversies. Also in April of 2017, busy month for David, a deeply spiritual man, sought to add a resolution protecting the right to life of the preborn to an amendment declaring April Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Not to detract from sexual assault awareness, but because by that time, 3 bills had been combined into one: sexual assault awareness, child abuse awareness, and recognition of Go Blue Friday to oppose child abuse. Thus, the issue of child abuse had already been made directly relevant. David then sought to add an amendment that regarded the killing of a preborn child to be the ultimate form of child abuse. And fair enough. By now, David had become so targeted by the establishment that the rules which govern the amendment process were broken by the chairwoman of the time, Gabrielle Ledoux. You may agree or disagree with David's proposal, but that's what debate is for, and that debate was denied improperly. We know this was done improperly because the resolution was eventually sent back to the House Rules Committee, where Ledoux, after David was forced to file a complaint, allowed his amendment and others to be considered. In the end, the Democrats decided that when faced with a choice, their love of abortion was more important to them than raising awareness of sexual assault and child abuse. And so they aborted their own bill rather than include the preborn amongst those for whom they ostensibly held concern. Of course, fitting to the pattern, matters of race, gender, and abuse are relevant to these lost souls only as much as they can use them for personal political benefit. And as soon as that changes, even the appearance of concern is jettisoned. Again, the story the media goes with here is not that David was standing up against capricious misuse of authority and for higher standards, but that David was obstructing or somehow opposed to sexual assault awareness, conveniently failing to mention how child abuse had been included into the bill, just like how David standing up for veterans of all ethnicities and against ethnicity-based language introduced into state law became twisted into David being a racist. The pattern here is that bad legislation is put forward, David acts in a principled way in response to it, and the media and corrupt establishment have a field day straw-manning and misrepresenting David in order to close off the minds of the people of Alaska to working with him. Not because he is any of those things they accuse him of, but because he stands as an obstacle to their corruption. Still not convinced? Let's keep going. Consider the infamous David hates Native women slanderous propaganda. When we look at its origins, we will see the very same pattern of the fire of principle producing the smoke of establishment insiders outraged at David's honesty. Smoke then fanned by the media to obscure and misrepresent the truth of the fire at the behest of their corrupt masters, turning outrage at principle into fake outrage at misrepresentation and slander. Why, as recently as 2023, David Eastman condemned the perilous forced sterilization by the Danish government of the native peoples of Greenland. And back in 2019, David co-sponsored a resolution mentioned earlier, H.R. 6, in the 31st legislature, expressing appreciation and support for the National Native American Veterans Memorial. If David had irrationally hated Native people, he wouldn't have co-sponsored that resolution. Obviously, his motivations aren't how the hateful left tries to twist them. David Eastman has always been a friend of those who care about faith, family, traditional values, heritage, and community. What needs to be understood here is that David is strongly pro-life. David understands that abortion hurts all parties involved in many ways, both visible and invisible. And furthermore, it also cheapens the value of human life. Back in May 2017, David, opposed to the cheapening of human life, spoke out against the immorality of state funding through Medicaid, paying for flights to Anchorage in order to get abortions, and more to the point, called for hearings on the flight program paid for by Medicaid in general. According to Suzanne Downing of Must Read Alaska, quote, "It's widely discussed in medical circles that rural Alaskans take flights to Anchorage for medical appointments and then don't show up at those appointments, but have their entire trips paid for by Medicaid, returning home with boxes filled with Costco purchases." End quote. The moral implications here are clear. What sort of example and precedent would be set by supporting the incentivizing of getting pregnant and killing an innocent human life in order to satisfy superficial, materialistic urges? Something like that spells the downfall of civilization and is not something state dollars should go towards funding and making more likely. Indeed, as David heard from various constituents, there are several different types of abuses involved with this Medicaid-funded travel for abortions. And indeed, these abuses can be carried out by members of either gender. And so David refrained from using language which, as the left likes to put it, assume the gender of the abusers of this system. For example, abuse from boyfriends involved. Among other things, the boyfriend getting an all-expense-paid trip to and from the city as an escort for the patient getting the abortion. The boyfriend is glad that she's pregnant, even if she isn't. One family told David about a woman who received, by that point in time, 11 abortions. Another story shared with David included a mom who abused her daughter by encouraging her to wait to have the abortion until after the 12th week so that they would qualify for the free trip to Seattle and could tend her daughter on a shopping trip to boost her emotions after the abortion, presumably. Then there was the teen who met a sidewalk counselor on her way to the clinic and learned that you actually have to be pregnant in order to have an abortion. She thought it was just a clump of cells still. Upon learning this, she didn't want to go through with it anymore. And then, and how monstrous is this? The state said they wouldn't pay for her return trip home until she went through with the abortion. My goodness. The free trip part is confusing to some in rural Alaska because they would say, well, it doesn't actually work that way. You wouldn't go through the hassle of trying to get pregnant just to get a free trip. We get free trips to go shopping all the time. It's more of an entitlement. So it includes abortion, but there were also free trips for, stubbing your toe. Just telling the local nurse your foot hurts real bad, and they will fly you out to the doctor or the hospital. Apart from the abortion connection, fomented outrage was sparked by the equally true reality of the fact that there are whole communities which view the Medicaid travel as their own personal taxi service. For example, a pilot in David's district crashed and died in Willow, taking a mom and her kid back after a Medicaid trip because they overloaded the plane with more than it could carry from everything bought in Anchorage. In fact, a different legislator got in trouble for doing essentially the same thing right around that time by having the legislature pay for him to move masonry and much else back to his rural Alaskan home. It's an entitlement. Between the heartbreaking horror stories of abortion-related abuse and the dangerous exploitation of a Medicaid-funded taxi service that used dollars which otherwise may have been better spent elsewhere, David showed leadership and initiative in the good government tradition and called for hearings on it. Once again, the fire came in the form of David behaving as an exceptional legislator ought to behave, and the smoke of outrage and attribution of false motivation to David was fanned in order to both kill the obviously much needed initiative for hearings on the matter and to punish David for daring to raise important questions about a popular but ultimately wasteful and harmful entitlement, and to further intimidate other observing legislators not to step out of line. By now, you should be able to guess what happened next. Instead of appreciating David's really legitimate perspective from the point of view of the sanctity of life and good government and preventing abuse, he was accused of being a racist, of hating Native women. Arguments were made like, who would be so callous as to get an abortion for free travel? The implication there being that David thinks so lowly of Native women as to imagine that an abuse of abortion could be possible. Yet, consider how chic it has become lately for pro-abortion activists to wear shirts that proclaim they are proud of receiving over 20 abortions, or that their abortion made them feel good and they enjoy it. Or the Satanic Temple now offers religiously motivated abortions, which is to say, human sacrifice. The fact of the matter is, David specified the villages only one time, by the way, because those are the places which are off the road system that qualify for flights paid for by Medicaid to receive abortions, not because of the ethnicity of the people who live in the villages, and only used the word a single time. But of course, that doesn't matter to the colluding and corrupt political establishment, nor to their lapdogs in the lying press. Indeed, it was after David called for legislative hearings into this practice that the vote for the 2017 censuring was held, referenced to in the legislature's censure speech as, quote, he doubled down. Once again, media smoke blowing serves several functions simultaneously, and one of the most important is how it covers up the fire of a real given political reality with fake outrage. Outrage that serves as an obscuring justification for actions taken to limit the knowledge and curiosity of observers and to punish the incorruptible. As a result of David standing up for morality in the use of state funds and for the dignity and integrity of communities already facing temptation towards socially promoted self-degradation, David was falsely framed yet again as a racist and officially censured by fellow legislators who saw exactly what was happening, how it was being orchestrated, and knew for sure that they didn't want to end up in the firing line. That mischaracterization was all it took to get censured, but in reality, it was just the excuse. And to this day, showing just how effective media spin can be when it's allowed to go unchallenged, uninformed minds cite this charade as an example of Eastman hating Native women, either deliberately mischaracterizing the situation or simply those who bought the spin, hook, line, and sinker. David used the word villages only one time, and in a perfectly logical way and without any reference to sex or ethnicity, and called for much needed hearings to address abuse of the system that hurt individuals as well as inefficiently strained a system in ways it wasn't intended to be used. And yet, this was the supposed justification for the first censuring of a legislator in Alaskan state history? Sometimes grand schemes conducted right out in the open succeed because it is difficult for the average person to conceive of just how practiced these institutions have become at their arts of deception. After all, when the media mischaracterizes in unison, death threats from misinformed constituents across the state start pouring in, as in fact is happening right now, as David's own children are now being threatened with murder to, quote, teach him a lesson. And all amidst the already existing top down pressure, only those with exceptional courage, like David, refuse to fold for the sake of their own political careers. And sadly, enough of the other legislators did fold. This too has become a pattern of how the Alaska State Legislature functions and how the elite kleptocracy maintains its grip on the state and the flow of wealth out of Alaska and pouring into the bank accounts registered in Seattle and elsewhere offshore where it is unlikely to ever be found. Let's move on to 2018. In 2018, a bill was put forward ostensibly on behalf of disabled Alaskans, SB 174, on February 2nd, dealing specifically with the administration of state programs on their behalf. In that bill, language was used that implied it is impossible for a disabled person to live a meaningful life without the beneficent charity of the state. Here is a sample of that language from page 3, line 6. Quote, take a flexible approach to administering programs for persons with disabilities that allow each person to participate actively with assistance based on the person's strengths and abilities in managing the person's support services. Here's the real kicker, so that the person can achieve a meaningful life in the person's home, job, and community. David had a problem with this, and for obvious reasons. No, not because David hates disabled people. David does not believe that all disabled people require some degree of state assistance in order for any of them to live meaningful lives, and in fact finds the idea repulsive. And he was perfectly happy to vote for the bill if they changed the language. Where's the proof for this? Why, the amendment he wrote up, pictured on the screen now, which both spells out exactly how his objections and provides much better language in its place that would have made it a bill he could have in good conscience voted for. Indeed, David was the only one to vote no on the legislation because, unfortunately, his very reasonable and respectful amendment was not adopted, with perhaps the original authors of the language feeling that the state, which provides resources, also at least deserves some credit for providing meaning to the lives of the disabled. Whatever the reasons for not adopting David's amendment, since that time, completely true to their predictable and inflexible form, we've seen already and will continue to see through much of the rest of this video, swamp creatures and their sniveling agents ignored David's true and stated rationale in favor of attributing false motivations in the public sphere of discussion for political benefit, aimed at corrupting the minds of those who read online headlines, with the idea of David as an intolerant person that hates the disabled, when the stark reality of his compassionate nature, as demonstrated by this amendment and elsewhere, is precisely the opposite. If you are watching this video now, have heard lies like this being repeated by others, but aren't yourself a committed partisan, then I ask you to think back to those who have most loudly and frequently repeated lies, such as those proven to be so in this video. Know that those sources seek to deceive and manipulate you on behalf of corrupt interests. In their confused minds, lying for a cause, tricking and deceiving the minds of those around them, and in a sense, spreading psychic pollution wherever they go, is all justified by the cause. Of course, in the end, this is a very mistaken view, as lies serve to undermine the cause of the liar in the long run, a point on which the liar disagrees. But they also spread disorder, inefficiency, eat away at the heart of the liar, and harm the many innocents they seek to manipulate by using the means of driving the public further away from proximity to the true, for the ends of getting the manipulated to act upon false pretenses which serve their selfish ulterior motives. Keep this in mind throughout this video. By July of 2018, the swamp had figured out that David could neither be bullied nor bribed, and furthermore, that a key aspect of his appeal is his commitment to principles and ethical conduct. So, what did the desperate parasites trying to protect and defend their hold on their hosts, the state and people of Alaska, try next? Well, they thought they might get away with pulling a fast one and doing that old political trick of attacking opponents where they are strong. And in David's case, though he is blessed with many strengths, one of his greatest strengths is his integrity. Therefore, they created a trumped-up ethics complaint. And trust me, you're going to love this one. So, when I hear that some politician violated ethics law or had some ethics complaint against them, I immediately just by habit assume it has something to do with money, bribes, election fraud, something corrupt and self-serving. And of course, whenever I see this record of an ethics complaint brought up, even to this day, it is done in a way that fits right in with all the other lies. So what are the facts here? Well, David at some point did indeed learn about some unethical conduct, but it wasn't a case the ethics committee could take for lack of jurisdiction. David wrote a letter to the House Rules Chair suggesting that legislators be encouraged not to share campaign fundraising advice with each other on the House floor during votes on bills. David observed this happening to a legislator sitting on the House floor during a vote when a different legislator was badgering them to change the vote. And when they didn't, the back and forth conversation was ended with them saying, then my PAC won't give you any money in the next election, as shown in David's complaint on the screen now. He sent a copy of this letter to all members of the House and omitted all names of anyone involved. That letter found its way to Must Read Alaska, which then engaged in unhelpful but possibly well-intentioned encouragement of someone to file an ethics complaint about it, though not just anyone has the jurisdiction to do so. If a filer had jurisdiction, David could have filed the complaint as he was in fact on the ethics committee at the time. But with the filer not having jurisdiction, this complaint never reached David for him to even become aware of its existence. Well, someone read Must Read Alaska, and a complaint was filed that David couldn't have known about. A reporter called the ethics committee trying to find out if a complaint had been filed. This reporter either lied or was confused about terminology and said that David told her there was a complaint. Yet, David had no way of even knowing that there could have been a complaint, as no one had told him, and discussing matters of ethical conduct and matters of complaint and investigation are two different things. David disclosed the existence of an ethical problem that was not an ethical complaint, and even made mention of it because it was never an issue that was under the statutory jurisdiction of the ethics committee in the first place. Months pass, and eventually David learned about the complaint. And by then, the crafty, opportunistic schemers had already accused David of, quote, leaking a complaint he couldn't have even known had been filed. Thus, David was put on trial for, quote, leaking a complaint he literally couldn't have leaked because he didn't have any knowledge of it. That was the smoke. And this time, the real fire was this whole payback operation in response to his sending out a letter about fundraising advice that infuriated the rhinos. David was then censured by being removed from the ethics committee, and just to attempt maximum damage, the leeches, with a smell for fresh blood, drug it out so that they could publicly announce his, quote, guilt before the trial, after the trial, and then again the week before the election. all for the same non-offense, and in fact, originating with David's choosing principle and higher conduct of ethical behavior over his own personal political self-interest. This story is one of punishment and retaliation for trying to once again push for higher ethical standards in the legislature. You cannot make this stuff up. You know that saying that whatever it is they're accusing you of is what they're actually doing? Well, there's a lot of truth to it. And this abuse and misuse of power against David is yet one more prime example. The ethics complaint against David was unironically an unethical abuse of power in retaliation for ethical concern appropriately expressed by David to serve the purposes of both keeping the rest of the legislators from getting any ideas and to further bias the public against David by creating headlines that attack one of David's core strengths and communicate a message totally opposite of what actually happened. What else happened in 2018? In Alaska, representatives chosen by the voters are elected or re-elected every 2 years, which meant that by 2018, David was facing a primary and a general election come November. Of course, beloved by the voters, David won. And that year, 23 of the 40 seats in the Alaskan House of Representatives were won by the GOP. This brings us to a different sort of false attack on David, an attack of a sort we'll be hearing more about later, and is in fact directly relevant to ongoing events today in February 2023 Alaska. Back in 2018, even on the face of it, it appears perplexing as to why, for some reason, the GOP decided to demand of its members that they agree ahead of time to vote for whomever the establishment chose to be Speaker of the House without preconditions. Well, once again, David does not agree to support matters of governance and policy blindly because doing so may hurt his constituents, and voting to make friends in Juneau is not why he was sent there in the first place. Still, David is one man, and the GOP won 23 seats. Not only did they not need to force this requirement for blind support onto the membership, an obvious problem if, say, for example, a Speaker of the House were chosen whom a majority of David's voters couldn't stand. Thus, there was all the room in the world for David to vote his conscience and for the GOP to retain its majority. Unfortunately, due to dissatisfaction with Republican leadership in the caucus, opportunistic Democratic overtures, and abject GOP incompetence, some of the elected Republicans, who are more of the betray your constituents for the establishment types, crossed the aisle, joined the Democrats, and created a Democratic-led House majority coalition. This is what can be determined through a cursory examination of the media reporting, but what is the real story here? Incredibly, before even the 2018 general legislative elections had been held, 13 legislators, whether misled or power hungry and conniving, met in secret and decided who would be Speaker, who would hold other key leadership positions, and so on, all by and amongst themselves. Even the number 13 was chosen because it represented the majority of votes in a caucus of up to 24 legislators, which was the high end of the Republicans who could possibly get elected that year. Those 13 could then control bringing in as many Democrats as needed to make sure the caucus policy decisions went their way, and they would never lose to the conservatives in the Republican caucus. What happened next is the very definition of the phrase, too smart by half. After the unlucky 13 had concluded their secret plans, 8 of the more conservative Republicans were brought in, including David, immediately after the election, and made a poor show of pretending like the key decisions were being made by all 21, such as electing Dave Tallarico as Speaker, and so on. Theatrical votes were then held on everything the 13 had already decided in order to ratify schemes the conservatives never had any input on. David politely declined to participate in the sham vote, didn't submit his request for committees, since by that point it was obvious his input would be ignored anyway, and said that he would need to talk with Tallarico personally before he committed to voting for him for Speaker, which, hey, sounds fair enough to me. But wouldn't you know it, he declined to talk with David that day and indeed for weeks afterwards. Personally, my guess is he stayed away from David because he knew on some level that they had been found out, and speaking with an astute observer like David would have only clued him in even more. Now, the legislative retreat they go on normally lasts a couple of days, owing to there being so many decisions to be made. But not this time. This time, all the big decisions had already been made. So they controlled and subverted the House GOP, went ahead and scheduled a press conference announcing their majority, speaker, and so on, to take place only 2 hours after the meeting started. Not days, but barely even hours. The unclean 13 decided that since some of the membership opposed being in a binding caucus, to put off making a decision about whether they'd be binding or not until some undefined later date. David declined to attend that press conference since he wouldn't be part of a binding caucus and he still hadn't had an opportunity to talk with Tallarico. Plus, their press conference was just a sham to pressure everyone into making a public display of commitment to the caucus anyway, which would have made it harder to back out of later once the 13 decided by majority vote to force the rest of them into a binding caucus. Nancy Dahlstrom, naturally one of the original 13, and oh, by the way, our current lieutenant governor, perhaps by then already seeing the writing on the wall, was appointed Commissioner of Corrections after winning her election to the House. And so, in declining to take her House seat, a vacancy was created more or less immediately following an election. And thus, Sharon Jackson was chosen as that appointment. Sharon naturally not being one of the 13 at the secret meeting. Well, Gary Knopp was mad because he wasn't chosen to be rules chair. And the whole cockamamie scheme fell apart, with several other Republicans voting to make Democrat Bryce Edgman the Speaker of a Democrat majority caucus. In a classic display of shameless politics, Bryce changed his voter registration from lifelong Democrat to undeclared lifelong Democrat 2 days before the actual vote so that the turncoat Republicans could pretend that they hadn't voted to elect a Democrat speaker. Once their secret machinations had fallen apart, and honestly, who likes being excluded and then having their own choices made for them by others? Those unclean 13, not the young and the restless, but the feckless and the reckless, quickly scanned the proverbial room for a scapegoat and decided to blame David, nominally, quote, for, quote, refusing to vote for Dave Tallarico, which supposedly then led all the turncoats to go vote for a Democrat for Speaker. In fact, despite everything and in the interest of preserving a GOP majority, deeply flawed though it was under the circumstances, as the best option available, David voted for Tallarico every time his name was on the ballot. Now, what happened to, well, David, you can't just vote no on everything, and sometimes you have to compromise. Turns out that propaganda is what the kids these days like to call cope. And cope and seethe they did. The Swamp omits that part of the story where David consistently voted for Tallarico since it's embarrassing to their narrative. It seems much more likely to me that their blame was directed at David because his non-participation in their various preceding sham ratifications, and at the heart of it, David's noticing and piecing together what the 13 Stooges were too clumsy to hide, stoked a resentful delusion far more satisfying to their obviously overinflated egos than having to face the truth that it was their very own machinations and incompetence at pulling them off, which led to the collapse of their own chance at power. If only they had gone about things the right way from the start, instead of their secret meetings and exclusion of conservatives, none of this would have happened. Still, even with 3 turncoat Republicans, that left 20 Republicans on one side who wanted a Republican temporary speaker and 20 Democrats. Rhino turncoats and, quote, independents like Bryce Edgman on the other, intending to vote in Edgman. By January 15th, 2019, an extremely capable black woman and a veteran had already been appointed by Governor Dunleavy to fill then District 13's vacant seat by the name of Sharon Jackson, who was present for the swearing in of legislators along with all of the others. On that day, a vote was supposed to be held for the temporary speaker for the House of Representatives, in which each district had the opportunity to have their say via their representatives in the selection process of the speaker, who will oversee the election of a permanent speaker for the remainder of that session. Well, each district except for one, that is, District 13, Despite Sharon Jackson already being appointed as a legislator at the time, she was, against the Alaska state constitution, singled out and forbidden from being sworn in until after the vote, thus denying Sharon and her over 17,000 constituents the opportunity to participate. Why? As a disrespectful and dishonorable shortcut to achieving a 20-19 vote in favor of the Democrats rather than go through the extra yet ultimately necessary and beneficial work of dealing with that 2020 vote situation, one that would have added pressure onto the turncoat Republicans for at least one of them to return to break the deadlock. Yet Sharon, being a strong black woman and a veteran, wasn't about to give up so easily. And before the election for temporary speaker took place, she took matters into her own hands and, knowing the law, marched on over to the nearby courthouse and had herself sworn in. So, who can legally swear in an Alaskan representative? Alaska state law covers this question. Who can legally administer an oath of office is spelled out clearly in AS 09.63.010. This law provides the authority for the lieutenant governor to administer oaths at the beginning of a legislative session. It also provides the authority for a judge or a deputy clerk of court to administer an oath of office. Notably, it provides no authority for a temporary Speaker of the House to administer an oath, which the Democratic coalition, now all of a sudden, for once concerned about rules and procedure, had promised would happen after the vote for temporary Speaker so that Sharon could participate in the vote for the permanent Speaker for that session. On the second day, when it became clear that the Democrats would not permit the lieutenant governor to swear in Representative Sharon Jackson, she grabbed two fellow military veterans, Representative Josh Rivak and a one David Eastman, walked over to the courthouse across the street from the Capitol and was sworn in by a deputy clerk at the courthouse. As her first official act as a legislator, she chose to follow the law, an example all Alaskan legislators would do well to follow. Meanwhile, with the election for temporary speaker still looming, Democrat legislators just declared that the oath of office she received at the courthouse shouldn't count, and that she should not be permitted to vote because of legislative, quote, rules. Rather than welcome Sharon as a freshman legislator as they should have, a swamp coalition in the House expressed their preference for Democrat minority party rule over a House Republican majority that contained conservatives in its ranks by refusing to accept her being sworn in. Now, if you believe the leftist propaganda about David, you might think that he was one of the people who voted to forbid her, or that it was his idea. But guess what? Precisely the opposite is true. Check it out for yourself on the legislative website. As you can see on page 12 of the House Journal of the Alaska State Legislature's first session of the 31st legislative session, David, in fact, was the singular representative who, even by that point in time, when her swearing in was rejected by the party that prides itself on smearing others as racist in the name of Black Americans and their turncoat GOP allies, refused to abandon her, stayed by her side, and took action to enable the nearly tens of thousands of Alaskans District 13 to have their voice heard, and for Sharon Jackson to be able to participate in the leadership election vote. Shamefully, Democrat Representative Tuck, who we'll hear more about later, objected to David's motion to waive the formalities preventing her from participation. Lieutenant Governor Meyer also shamefully ruled David's motion out of order. David appealed this ruling, and then, most shamefully of all, apart from David, all 38 other reps voted on camera to disenfranchise the already sworn in only Black legislator in the House and forbid her from having a voice in the leadership selection process. And it was only David Eastman who stood up for Sharon and the people of District 13. By the way, these legislative rules Democrats had inexplicably come to care so much about that Sharon supposedly had to be excluded, were so important. Well, those rules, immediately after they won the election, they voted to suspend them and permit her to be sworn in immediately. Funny how that works, isn't it? In fact, when it comes to matters of race, both intentionally skewing the motivations of others and behaving hypocritically by their own standards whenever it suits them, these issues reveal that the left and those in the media who cynically manipulate identity politics the loudest don't in fact care one bit about the individuals of any ethnicity, apart from how they can be used rhetorically for personal political power. Power, wealth, influence, and hedonism are the sum total of their various concerns, and everything else merely rhetoric to serve those ends. They might say Black Lives Matter when it suits them, but in reality, from abortion to foreign wars to dangerous crime bills to mandating experimental vaccines to facilitating fentanyl trafficking with open borders to higher taxes and gas prices, starvation, inflation at the grocery stores, traumatizing children with masks and sexual propaganda, and partially or one day completely stolen PFDs rerouted to big donor owned interests and businesses. No lives matter but ours would be a much more accurate and honest slogan for them to say. Really, the shameless audacity of these people knows no bounds. Two of the complaints against David are that he is supposedly, quote, difficult to work with because he bothers to read bills and add what he feels are relevant amendments whilst voting his conscience, and therefore they claim ultimately bad for his constituents for, quote, not getting anything done, despite doing more for his constituents in his first year than many reps ever do. And whilst he is on the one hand isolated and ineffectual, supposedly, he also has all of the power in his hands to single-handedly be responsible for the collapse of the GOP majority. Detractors like to distract from this by claiming David has a so-called victim complex. Gaslighting, if I've ever heard it. Arguing that it can't, quote, always be that he's being singled out. But when the record is what the record is, and that record is combined with the incoherent contradictions from the swamp in their attempts at covering their behinds, hoping constituents like me will never be able to piece it together, David comes out far and away as the party in the most credible position, and it's not even close. Obviously, if the incompetent leadership had not insisted upon a bad demand of its caucus members and betrayed their trust before elections even happened with secret and exclusive meetings held months in advance, the process would have played out organically without that fiasco of a mess and eventually Democrat House majority coalition. Second, how on earth is it David's responsibility that other for sale rhinos were able to be tempted to join the Democrats? Or heck, how could he even have had the power to make them do so even if he wanted to? The real question is, why is it that the GOP leadership could not keep its own members from leaving? The answer here is clearly incompetence. What an absolute circus. I wish I could say that's the end of it, but the hysterical and bought out Alaskan left, people Vladimir Lenin would have referred to as useful idiots, grasped for every straw within reach. In 2019, after winning his re-election in 2018 by another landslide, still after everything we just talked about, thanks to those pesky voters who pay attention to what's going on and see through the lies, another bad bill came up, and David voted against this bill, this time about Black History Month. You know, the outrageous thing is, if people would just speak to the man or listen to what he has to say, his positive and constructive intentions would be obvious to anyone engaging in good faith listening and dialogue. As David himself said, he did not feel spending time insulting African American Alaskans with feel good legislation during an epidemic of multiple crises was respectful, and in fact was fundamentally dishonest. This sort of perspective and language resonates with many conservatives of all backgrounds and skin colors. In fact, if leftists would take a break for a minute from private messaging Black conservatives' racial slurs on social media and instead listen to what they have to say, they too would realize just how condescending and unhelpful the leftist establishment is regarded to be by Black conservatives, and with how much more respect and dignity they are treated by honest men like David Eastman. Once again, this is a fundamental difference between David, the man of principle, and the Juno swamp creatures who run from principle the way vampires run from the dawn of day, caring only about their own careers and measuring their success as representatives, not in how devotedly they represent the interests and views of their constituents, not in how much they improve their lives, but merely how often they can vote with the majority and please the highest donors and most influential media figures. Who today hears about David's singular support for Sharon Jackson? Who today hears about the black Republican legislator recently assassinated in New Jersey? And these people dare to call David a white supremacist. What sort of white supremacist stands alone on behalf of the only black legislator in the Alaskan House of Representatives in order to include her in a key vote for leadership? What happened to systemic structures of institutionalized institutions and all that woke gobbledygook when it came time to treat the only black legislator and a woman like all the other representatives were treated, and as she deserved to be treated? Where were their supposed woke principles when they voted to treat Sharon like a second class citizen by forbidding her from participating in the governing institutional process in order to hold on to more power for themselves? Was a strong black woman too much for you to handle? Did you think including her would make things too messy and difficult? Answer me that, you shameless hacks. Yeah, that's what I thought. Of course, with the arrival of 2020, that meant another election year, and wasting very little time, David, a loyal member of a now minority GOP caucus that, as a fan of Pokemon would say, became a minority party despite winning majority of the seats by hurting itself in its confusion, and ought to have been a majority were it not for incompetent leadership, moved in March to get the ball rolling once again and stripped David from his committee positions. This so-called probation maneuver was probationary because that was all that was required for it to serve its political purpose, which is to say, providing a refreshing talking point for what the swamp had planned next. How far will they go? Well, believe it or not, for the 2020 primary season, with the wind of manufactured probationary committee stripping headlines in their sails, some of the House GOP Rhino caucus stampeded up from Anchorage and started knocking on doors in the valley for David's swamp-eager primary opponent, Jesse Sumner. Anchorage reps Laddie Shaw, Sarah Rasmussen, Kathy Tilton, Kelly Merrick, and Mel Gillis led the pack. I assume they kept the Valley voter mockery limited to their time in cars and out of earshot. Oh, and Kathy, by the way, even admitted in her own words, even whilst campaigning against David but still blaming him, that the defections away from the GOP in 2018 were being blamed on David as an excuse, and instead caused by other factors. Now, this isn't to say that all other GOP besides David are rhinos, but unfortunately, there are many who at times appear to be awfully comfortable acting like rhinos. This particular fast one they were going for were by then the old and debunked talking point that David magically caused the GOP majority to collapse all by himself. But also remember, according to them, he has no influence. And this time, a new one, the supposed cause of the aforementioned committee stripping, David's exercising of his right to oppose state funding to Planned Parenthood, and his taking a stand for the voters and voting against the Elizabeth Petrovich coin fiasco. Now let me ask you this. If I came up with a proposal to build a monument to kitty cats and puppy dogs, and that process were convoluted and extremely wasteful, and you opposed it on the grounds of its wastefulness, would that automatically mean that you hate kitty cats and puppy dogs? No, of course not. Yet, the sneaky and conniving, power-hungry globalist lapdogs used exactly that attack on David, that the only reason he could have voted against this coin is because he must hate Native women, hoping to convince people of a false pattern by following up on the previous misattribution of motivation in the Medicaid-funded flights manufactured controversy that got him censured for, in reality, challenging an entitlement program, with yet another instance, and far from the last, of misattribution of motivation with the manufactured coin outrage, in which David expressed his opposition perfectly reasonably, and everything he expressed, except for his vote, was ignored, because the truth, as it so often does, got in the way of the power-hungry wielders of lies. What is the reality about the proposal for the Petrovich coin, and why did David vote no? First of all, the request was for Congress to fund 5 million new $1 coins and then indefinitely fund a marketing campaign spending millions of dollars to convince Alaskans to use them. Talk about spending money to make money. Second, David was very clear. He looked into the reasonableness and feasibility of this proposal and found that, according to those racist misinformation experts over at the National Public Radio, quote, $1 billion in dollar coins are stacked up in Federal Reserve vaults around the country because Americans don't want them. The dollar coin program has become a waste of money and space. Congress initiated the effort to promote presidential history and to build up interest in dollar coins as substitutes for bills, but the government wildly misjudged demand. Wow. Now, does that sound familiar or what? Who knew NPR was so racist? To top it all off, according to the General Accounting Office, the last time a marketing campaign was undertaken to encourage greater use of a new dollar coin, the government spent nearly $70 million in year 2000 equivalent dollars to do so. And the result was a public very well informed about a new dollar coin they still weren't interested in using, which is to say, the marketing was a failure. Once again, to this very day, this vote is brought up not as an example of David courageously standing by reason and good government principles, but as an example of irrefutable proof of racism against Native women, since, as the argument goes, there could be no good reason to vote against the bill, thus it must be racism. What they leave out in their typical quest to misattribute motivations are, as always, the completely reasonable and openly stated good reasons for the vote that have absolutely nothing to do with race. This makes as much sense as claiming that David Eastman hates bunny rabbits if he voted against spending millions of dollars to mint and promote the use of a $1 coin featuring Bugs Bunny. As far as Perotrovich goes, the real insult to her here is that the supposed advocates of her legacy, but again, as is typical, the in reality mere users of her legacy couldn't come up with a better way to honor her legacy. In any case, it was nominally for this terrible crime of voting based upon reason applied to research regarding the topics of the bills he votes upon in the public interest that David was stripped of his committee positions. But in reality, I think the approaching primary election had much more to do with it. Returning now to the primary season, the 2018 GOP self-implosion falsely blamed upon David and the Perotrovich coin vote were the primary talking points of the Anchorage rhinos who were going door to door on behalf of a man they knew they could do business with, so to speak, the moment they saw him. A man the swamp would do anything to replace David with. And these fabrications of history were the arguments made on behalf of the notion that the voters should instead support the compromise candidate beloved by the swamp, Jesse Sumner. He was styled as the compromise candidate, but in reality, he's more like the compromised candidate who compromises his voters' interests for the sake of their own and in order to better please the corrupt and influential higher ups. Well, this may shock you, but despite Valley voters being mocked by arrogant Anchorage politicos as so-called Valley trash, or as racist, ignorant hicks, and coming face to face at the doors to their homes with Sarah Rasmussen, pictured on the screen now, for some reason, a bunch of Anchorage rhinos coming up to the Valley and knocking on doors telling the people they know better who they should vote for than they do, did not work out. And once again, David won his primary. And you know what? Despite all of this accumulating drama and distorted narrative perception made possible by the asymmetric distribution of communication resources over the years, by the end of 2020, over the course of his short career thus far, David Eastman won 3 landslide general elections in a row. Now, I don't care how ideological or partisan or even hateful a David hater might be, it simply does not pass the smell test to imagine that David, after facing this constant onslaught of misrepresentation, is reelected again and again by his voters simply for no reason, or as delusional leftists would like to believe, because they're dumb and racist. This is not because, as later agents of disenfranchisement, which we'll be getting to soon, claim, that is, that the vast majority of the voters of then District 10 are all deplorables or irredeemable racists not worthy of consideration or being listened to or even having a vote that matters, but rather because they, naturally, of all the people in the state, have the closest regular look at their representative, and because they are able to see through the lies and the propaganda. And when a bad bill with a nice-sounding name is put forth with the foreknowledge that weak representatives will fall in line to vote for it, and David will be the only one with the courage to not sell out his constituents for the sake of a bad bill and a shiny package, they know that it's certainly no coincidence. They see through the tricks and the one-sided slander and misrepresentation, and that is why he was and remains so popular amongst his constituents and consistently wins re-election. This, however, presents its own danger for David, and that danger blossomed into full hysterical madness from the establishment in 2021, but especially 2022, and continues on to this day. They truly pulled out all the stops. Here is another totally trumped up controversy. Back in early 2022, a bill that had been about officiation of marriage was changed at the last minute to bar 14 and 15-year-olds from marrying. Sounds good, except under the law, it was still legal for them to have intercourse with similar aged partners and have abortions. Now, what kind of message does that send? That sex and abortions are fine, but marriage is bad? So, David wrote up an amendment that allowed for marriage between similarly aged partners, where they could only get married if intercourse between them were already legal. And then they supposedly didn't have enough time for it to be even offered up to be voted upon. The amendment is on the screen now, and the law referred to, AS.11.41.434, makes clear that this applies only to people within a similar age range. Therefore, adults wouldn't be marrying kids, or 14 or 15-year-olds. And if the state thinks people are old enough for abortions, how is it that the marriage is regarded as worse than an abortion? With his amendment not considered, he voted against the bill as it was written, knowing that the bill could have and should have been better. And doing so to highlight the inconsistency in the law of the land he did his utmost to fix. Yet, uninformed, or more often the case, intentionally lying leftists to this day still repeat that David supports adults marrying children in order to have sex with them, despite the fact that his amendment would have made it impossible for adults to marry children. Nothing could be further from the truth, and he has stated as much explicitly. Are you getting the picture of how disgusting and dishonest these folks are, and more to the point, how desperate? You see, with David, the establishment has a real conundrum. How is it that despite their best efforts, all of the media manipulation, the onslaught of one-sided coverage, the legislative traps set up that take advantage of David's honesty and consistency, how is it that he keeps winning re-election? Why can't they get rid of this man who insults them by refusing to soak himself by their sides in the dirty Juneau swamp water? To deal with this crisis of control and this threat to the absolute power of the political establishment, a wicked scheme was concocted, every favor called in, and every means of influence was brought to bear to take him down, which makes even the so-called child marriage setup look like amateur hour in comparison. First, David's personal information was hacked. Some of you may recall the Democrats screaming about hack and leak, but of course, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. In this hacked leak, it was revealed that David, being the first Eagle Scout in his family, the veteran, firefighter, and representative loyal to his constituents that he is, had years earlier joined the veterans organization known as Oath Keepers, who simply reaffirmed their oath of loyalty to the United States Constitution. As you will recall, the election season of 2020 was marred by many gross irregularities in the counting process. As a result, two things relevant to our situation here happened. First, a great deal of the public felt outraged and concerned and therefore headed to Washington, D.C. to protest. And second, David Eastman, being a man especially close to his constituents, heard his constituents' interest in the peaceful rally on January 6th and flew to D.C. to attend the president's speech. David watched President Trump's speech, where Trump called for calm and peace, and David later met up with fellow Alaskans at the Grant Memorial near the Capitol. David himself never went into the Capitol, and it is confirmed today, despite yet another example of media lies claiming to the contrary, that Antifa provocateurs were in the crowd, along with FBI agents, and indeed noted provocateur Ray Epps, who riled up the crowd to enter the Capitol and remains unarrested to this day, that very same Capitol building that had its doors opened for the crowd from the inside. Unfortunately, a riot was sparked, and an innocent protester, Ashley Babbitt, was shot and murdered, something David would learn about hours later, after which the new president and party in power, facing substantial questions about its legitimacy, had the excuse it needed to crack down on political dissidents, some of whom remain in the D.C. gulag to this day. Membership dues paid to a veterans organization dedicated to living by and reaffirming the oath sworn to protect and defend the United States Constitution with nearly 40,000 members nationwide, and standing to watch President Trump give a speech calling for calm in D.C. on January 6th. These were the great offenses perpetrated by David Eastman that would go on to spark the next ridiculous saga. By this point in time, all of the lies and slanders about David had time to marinate amongst the corrupt Alaskan political class and the indifferent, opportunistic weather vanes alike, along with the voters of those districts who had no regular need or opportunity to learn about David any more than what the lying media presented about him in the headlines. And so, when, after hacked records were leaked showing David to be a member of Oath Keepers, albeit an inactive one, those organized colluding forces, by now long dissatisfied with the failures of all the usual tricks and string pulling to turn David's constituents against him, well, they decided that they weren't about to let a little old thing like representative government and majority vote get in the way of removing David Eastman and picking the representative of his district for the voters, with their eyes set on 2022. The opening salvo of this shameful plot began in late October 2021 with the definitely unrelated hack and leak. We'll get to the trial in a bit, the one David won, but something revealed in that trial is that the extent of David's communications with the Oath Keepers was a couple of emails about membership fees sent years earlier, and then, count them, one forwarded mass email, which is to say he received a mass email sent out to all nearly 40,000 members, an email that contained no call to violence or anything illegal, and forwarded it to someone else. Looking back on it, it seems like the hack and leak was the signal sent out to the conspiracy of disenfranchisers to get to work doing their parts. Oh, by the way, for those of you unfamiliar with this next sequence of events, you might think that the phrase conspiracy of disenfranchisers must be hyperbole, or simply not true. But soon you will see that is the most succinct and accurate way to describe the people involved in what happened next. On October 20th, 2021, as stated, hacked information was released. Mere days after the leak, a petition called Expel Eastman was given new life and reinvigorated, evidently under the premise that legal membership in a loyalty-focused veterans organization was simply too much. When the petition was originally started in January 2021, at the time they knew nothing about Oath Keepers because the leak hadn't happened yet. And so for the time, it was more of the usual Orwellian doublespeak of people trying to disenfranchise voters and overturn elections, calling limited government constitutional conservatives like David fascists, especially if they listened to a speech by the president calling for calm and peace. They did know David went to hear the president's speech, and that was enough for them to hold rallies, petitions, and the whole campaign to have him expelled from office. They only pivoted to Oath Keepers after their campaign through most of 2021 had resulted in total failure, and his email was hacked. After the leak in October, which in and of itself revealed nothing wrong, and the creation of the petition by communists and communist intermediaries working with the Alaskan branch of a self-described communist organization known as the Party for Socialism and Liberation, spearheaded and to this day takes credit for spearheading the creation of the reinvigorated coalition to expel David Eastman, organized through the last 2 months of 2021 and then officially announced January 2022. Not only did they totally inaccurately refer to David as a fascist, demonstrating supreme ignorance about both David's limited government politics and what the word fascism actually means, but they then took their campaign to social media, where the overt communists like PSL and their crypto-communist allies amongst the Alaskan left consistently amplified each other's voices any chance they got, essentially covering the left bases of the Swamp Uniparty. Incredibly, the reinvigorated Expel Eastman campaign was not even a month old before the House Committee on Committees on January 31st voted 5-2 to remove David from all legislative committees in response to what had been revealed by hacking at that time. Membership dues paid to a veterans organization he first joined in 2010 and had had zero contact with in years. Who says government doesn't act quickly when it wants to? And wouldn't you know it, not even 2 weeks later, then Democrat House Majority Leader Chris Tuck on the aforementioned committee would attend a February 12th town hall organized to a substantial degree by his friends at the Party for Socialism and Liberation, who brag about his attendance on their website, dedicated to circumventing legitimate elections and the sanctity of representative government, whilst ironically calling others fascists. See, they always accuse you of being what they are. There is another particularly egregious example of this. When David spoke up against the authoritarian COVID mandates and quoted a prominent Jewish authority on civil rights and the dangers of assuming it can't happen here, the opportunistic deceivers in the swamp and those in the party of Ilhan Omar jumped on their chance to call David a Nazi and an anti Semite, as he was literally quoting a prominent and respected Jewish source against the sort of policies actual authoritarians would support, resulting in further condemnation in the House and one of the most shameful, bizarro world twisting of intent to date, topped only perhaps by his being called a Nazi when he quoted a speech made by Hitler, not because he supported what was said, but to draw attention to the similarities as a warning from the past. Once again, they always accuse you of that which they themselves are guilty. Oh, and by the way, 2 days prior to Tuck's attendance at the Communist Town Hall, he chaired the first investigation into the Oath Keepers themselves, disingenuously starting off on the note of it not being an attack on David himself. Despite this conniving claim, Tuck gave a platform to the two left-wing hacks in his committee, people who would later be called as the only, quote, witnesses to testify against David in his trial. And because of this, they could then claim they were experts and had testified before a legislature and had a connection with Alaska only because he gave them airtime in his committee, all while claiming he wasn't targeting David. Ultimately, David would not be removed by vote from his committees because of his perfunctory membership. The idea was tabled and never brought to the House floor for a vote, likely out of concern held by Republican politicians about backlash from their base. Yet, though the left wing of the Uniparty bird was tired out for a time and needed an arrest, the right wing of the Uniparty, which is to say the swamp rhinos, tagged in and sprung into action with their own rationale. By the time April 2022 rolled around, David was removed from two of his committees and caucus by vote of the Republicans. Why? You tell me. No, really, I'm serious. Look it up. None of the Republican legislators who were asked what David was being punished for could give a straight answer. Everything was, oh, it's a combination of things, but no one particular vote. And they also clarified, no, it isn't because of the Oath Keeper membership. Of the various dodges and excuses given, the most enlightening and illustrative has to be David's association with the Foundation for Applied Conservative Leadership, or FACL, or FACL. Days before the vote to strip Eastman of some of his committee positions and the ability to caucus at the end of the session, the Alaskan Republican Party held its convention, and at that convention, a one Rep. Kevin McCabe introduced a resolution condemning the organization and forbidding the state GOP from providing financial support or endorsements to candidates which fight to help representatives sent to Juneau as conservatives stay conservative. What's so bad about FACL? Quoting Representative McCabe, FACL's main thing is to try to hold other Republicans accountable for their actions. They do that by finding those that they think are a little bit more moderate than they are and attacking them, making them feel pain. Yes, you heard that right. Let's take a moment to digest here. After the left wing of the Uniparty ran out of steam and needed time to recuperate, the Rhino wing, once again, months before an election, voted to prevent David from caucusing and stripped him of some committee positions for reasons that ranged from, quote, a number of things, to outrage at the conservative grassroots daring to interfere in swamp politics by holding representatives elected as conservatives accountable for how they vote. Oh no, anything but that. That's not spin for me, by the way. That's how the person who introduced the resolution to condemn FACL described them. The clearest answer the public could get as to why the GOP punished David was that he is associated with people who try to keep them honest and accountable to their own voters for how they vote in their own words. Furthermore, let's get a few things straight here about both David's relationship with FACL and Kevin McCabe. According to Kevin and the other swamp creatures that parrot this narrative, David runs this group called FACL, and anyone criticizing a Republican legislator is doing so at David's behest, and because they are a part of this group called FACL that David somehow supposedly controls. That's the narrative. In reality, it's not even a group, and David certainly doesn't run it. In fact, what it is a class on how to hold politicians accountable for the decisions they make on behalf of their constituents. No, a class on holding any politicians accountable. But since it is taught to people who include conservatives and cleaning up the neighborhood starts with your own backyard, their focus includes Republican politicians. Yes, David has taken the class and encourages others to do so as well. However, the research shows that's the full extent of his association with them. However, when you're a representative like David, who also happens to invite and welcome accountability from his constituents and believes every legislator is improved when they have people who are willing to hold them accountable and pull back against that unceasing pull the swamp further into the muck. Second, neither David nor either of his staffers attacked Kevin McCabe. Kevin was elected with the support of Alaska Gun Rights, a group who spent more than $1,000 against his opponent, Representative Mark Newman, after Newman voted to kill their pro-Second Amendment budget amendment. With the support of Alaska Gun Rights, Kevin got elected, and he also said he would support a particular Second Amendment bill. Based upon what we've heard about Kevin so far, it should come as no surprise that he never did. Then, in an incredibly brazen act of soulless swamp-style politics, he voted to kill the very same pro-Second Amendment budget amendment that his predecessor had voted to kill. That very same bill he attacked his predecessor for voting against, amendment rather, and the record of which he used, along with his promise to support it, got him elected, and which had earned the ire and opposition of Alaska Gun Rights against his former opponent, Mark Newman. Utterly unsurprisingly, Alaska Gun Rights then, naturally, told people about what he'd done. That is the full extent of what Kevin means when he claims FACL attacked him. True, David does have a staffer on the board of Alaska Gun Rights, but he had nothing to do with the flyer they put out telling people about what Kevin McCabe had done. Even so, Kevin accused David and Jared, his staffer, of being unethical by having a staffer serving on a board of an extreme political activist group that attacks or bullies legislators. And Kevin even tried to have Jared fired. He was almost certainly behind firing Pam, who he also tried to get fired last year. We'll hear more about that awful and petty situation in a bit. This can be said with confidence because he's the only legislator who threatened to fire either of David's staff during his first 6 years in the legislature, and he threatened to fire both of them for different things, neither of which they nor David were ever responsible for. Always something somebody else did that gets attributed to them by Kevin, who then attributes it to David by association. In a way, this is almost becoming like their calling card. Try to attack in ways that hurt through the use of lies, and do so without exposing the real reason for the attack. David doesn't promise to vote for bills he hasn't read yet, and he doesn't disown good, honest people like Jared, Pam, and Pat. This sums up most of why they have ever punished David, whether by kicking him off of his committees, firing his staff, censuring him, smearing him, or whatever. Even otherwise good human beings serving in the legislature, if they lack courage, cower and conform to the wishes of the leftists. In this way, rhinos and leftists are able to instill fear and rule in an unholy alliance that regards true political skill as how convincingly they can enrich backers by fooling voters and tricking or intimidating uncooperative legislators. Obviously, David has a much different political philosophy, and we'll see that demonstrated when we cover bills he has sponsored and co-sponsored later. Okay, let's keep moving forward in time. The left wing and the rhino wing of the Uniparty, now satisfied in their individual attacks, it was then time to come together. By June 13th, 2022, 24 complaints with redacted names were filed against David's right to run for re-election and appear on the ballot, despite winning overwhelming support in past elections again and again, with many of those names, which we know because they admitted as much in public, comprised of those who previously went door-to-door against David and lost, like Rasmussen, Sumner, and so on. Nonetheless, in a quick and definitive decision, the Alaska Division of Elections found that, quote, by a preponderance of the evidence, David Eastman was, in fact, eligible to run for re-election regardless of Oath Keepers membership, which had been the nature of the complaints filed. Well, that should be case closed, right? Enter Rhino Randall Kowalski, colleague and friend of the communists and the face of the most direct attack on the rights of the voters in the state of Alaska yet ever conceived. Kowalski and his cadre of shadowy backers actually filed a lawsuit and sued David Eastman and the Alaska Division of Elections, arguing that DOE made the wrong decision and that Eastman's name should be stripped from the ballot. Don't let the voters vote for who they want to vote for. By August, local papers were reporting on the lawsuit, and shortly after, Anchorage Judge Jack McKenna refused to remove David's name from the ballot so close to an election, which is a good call, but also ordered that he not be certified, no matter the scale of his future election victory, until after the lawsuit's trial was concluded. The most incredible part is yet to come. As many of you will know, Alaska has a newly adopted ranked choice voting system. In 2022, David was running against two other Republican opponents, splitting the vote three ways. Kowalski's lawyer was delighted when they found out that in the event David were to be ruled ineligible to hold office following the conclusion of the trial, the second place vote receiver would be installed as the representative of the voters of District 27, the newly created district following redistricting which David would then represent. As it would turn out, David would, despite his voters not even knowing whether their votes would count or not, itself a sort of voter suppression and election interference, and despite running against two other Republican candidates, still go on to win a majority of the vote in the first round. Though, of course, he still would not be certified until after the trial in December, hastily arranged and the sort of thing which would normally take years to do. This meant that from the time after the election until the results of the trial, whether the majority vote getter David or the super minority less than 30% of the vote receiver Stu Graham would become the representative of those who turned out and voted on election day hung in the balance. Just who is Stu Graham and what did he run on? Stu came across as a Jesse Sumner, less interested in pretending to be conservative and even more enthusiastic about pleasing the corrupt establishment. Stu's background is what you might call a Chamber of Commerce good old boy Rhino Republican, dedicated to less disagreement within the caucus and more agreement on carrying out the dictates from globalists and wealthy donors from above. In fact, in the mathematically rigorous study of political decision-making known as electorate theory, large winning coalitions, such as those David has, are associated with a greater quality of life for all residents, less corruption, and more honest government where the resources at the disposal of the state are much more likely to be directed towards public goods. This makes perfect sense, and indeed, we saw this play out with David's support for the Bogard roundabout. Conversely, however, when leaders are put into power with the backing of a tiny winning coalition, quality of life drops dramatically, corruption skyrockets, and public resources are shifted away from being spent in the interests of the public welfare and instead become directed towards enriching key benefactors. This is the structure of every kleptocracy that has ever existed. Instead of a healthy and vibrant representative government, the smaller the winning coalition is in comparison to the rest of the population, the greater and more voracious the kleptocracy to come. And what are the people who have no say in this process called, according to electorate theory? Literally, they are known as the disenfranchised. In the event that David had lost his eligibility trial filed by Kowalski, the over 50% of the voters who chose David to be their representative and by all rights ought to have him be their representative, and those other voters who chose to vote for the third candidate, all would have been moved into the disenfranchised category. The result would have been a business as usual swamp publican with a tiny fraction of the vote installed by political activists and attorneys who don't live in the district and against the wishes of the majority of the voters as expressed on election day. It cannot possibly be overstated just how disastrous this would have been for precedent in the state of Alaska, and especially for the people of District 27, who would have been reduced to, at best, an afterthought, and more likely regarded as creatures worthy only of exploitation and contempt along the path to further career advancement. Remember when I said there was a conspiracy of disenfranchisers? Yeah, if you didn't believe me before, now you have your proof. In fact, this is far from the only example. Jesse Sumner, not the brightest of men, but also for that very reason a favorite of the swamp, filed a complaint against David's right to run in 2020. That very same year, he himself was running against David and was receiving all the support Anchorage rhinos could muster. A complaint, get this, based upon the frankly embarrassing premise that David, spending much of his time in Juneau, since, that's where the legislators legislate, ought to disqualify him from running in Wasilla by virtue of changing his residency. Imagine going through the entire process of filing that complaint and not once considering that it would apply to every legislator except those who live in Juneau. Honestly, I feel bad for District 28, which Jesse now nominally represents. I really do, because that's just embarrassing. Thankfully, despite all the nonsense and hardship, through David's being forced to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawyer fees just to defend the right of the people of District 27 to vote, and through the onslaught of lies and propaganda in the media, ultimately the groundlessness of the lawsuit was too much even for this coalition of conspirators to overcome. David won his lawsuit. Kowalski decided not to appeal, and David was finally and rightfully certified as representative of the voters of District 27 in January 2023. End of story? Oh no, you know better than that by now. As soon as David won, there were already multiple plans in motion to continue the attacks on him. First, a petition was created by a special interest group known as AK Purg, demanding that David's fellow legislators expel him from the legislature. Their thirst for disenfranchising a majority of voters with whom they disagree evidently not yet quenched, and promoted by individuals like Bill Walker's former chief of staff, Scott Kendall. Second, before the calendar even hit 2023, a plot was hatched to attack David's staffers. In the first case, AK Purg's petition failed, though there is thankfully now also a petition going around to investigate AK Purg over this. When they couldn't punish David directly for winning his election, they decided to attack he and his constituents directly by firing one of his star employees. Before we provide the background context to that situation, then show some of what David stands for, and then ultimately conclude this video, it is finally time to discuss the 2022 Alaska Principal of the Year, Mary Fulp, and her wrongful detainment and violation of bodily autonomy on the grounds of religious persecution, lies, fraud, and corruption, and finally explain what David Eastman, the Roundabout on Bogart, and Mary Fulp have in common. Well then, who exactly is Mary Fulp? Mary Fulp served as Colony Middle School principal from 2007 to 2022, during a time when the name Colony conveyed excellence in education. Come July 2022, Mary was hired to be the new principal of Colony High School, and by November 2022, the Alaska Association of Secondary Principals had named her Alaska Principal of the Year. Mary is also a devout follower of Jesus Christ and has written several books on the topic of her faith over the course of her career. Obviously, given her long and illustrious career, her ability to write coherently on complex topics and to fulfill her challenging duties with excellence, Mary's faith was never any sort of impediment to her work. On the contrary, she makes it clear in her books just how much her faith in and love for Jesus Christ has helped her to succeed for the good of others during the course of her life. Not only does all of this sound perfectly normal, it would be extremely reasonable to say that the world would be much better off if there were more people in it like Mary Fulp. On January 15th, 2023, so just a few weeks prior to the creation of this video, Mary posted a live stream on Facebook where she shared her joy and conviction with the world in terms completely consistent with and within the bounds of her faith, which includes the ability to speak in tongues, something recognized in Pentecostal churches across the world, amongst others, and in the Bible. In fact, my own grandmother spoke in tongues, and she, sure enough, never had to be institutionalized for it. Mind you, Mary wasn't incoherent, she wasn't a danger to herself or others, she wasn't threatening or erratic, she wasn't forcing her faith on anyone else. Agree or disagree with Mary's faith. If it has helped her to become the success she has, then more power to her. And if her expression of faith doesn't resonate with you, why, you don't have to watch the live stream now, do you? This is where things turn very dark very fast. On January 18th, 2023, unfortunately estranged family members went to her home and confronted her. Now, this confrontation wasn't a mental health check, but more like a religiously dogmatic one. The family who showed up demanded that she recant her belief in her ability to speak in tongues. Now, let me ask you this. If you believe lying is a sin, and you are convinced that a known and accepted detail of your faith applies to you, would you be in a rush to lie to the world about the faith that means so much to you, and in Mary's case, played such a large role in getting her to where she had gotten in life? If you're a person of courage and integrity, no, of course you wouldn't. As a result of family demanding she lie to the world about her faith and refusing to leave her property until she complied, despite her requests that they go, it was in fact Mary who first felt compelled to call the troopers. Once they arrived, the troopers offered to evict those estranged family members, and Mary, ever compassionate, asked her family to leave voluntarily so as to avoid any further unnecessary trouble. And they did. Folks, you know how some atheists out there think they're being funny when they equate the Christian faith with incapacitating psychosis or mental illness? Well, perhaps ego bruised and bent on revenge, one of those estranged family members got the bright idea to call 911 on Mary and say she is mentally unstable and needs a check by the troopers, a sort of retaliatory trooper call, if you will. So the troopers respond. They go back and speak to Mary, and what would come as absolutely no surprise to any reasonable person, the troopers determined she was perfectly mentally sound and went along their way. Although things never should have got that far in the first place, that was definitely where things should have stopped. But they didn't. Due to the fact that at present, different people are shifting the blame for what happened next onto each other and keeping a lot of it secret, some of the actual details remain unknown at this time. But what is known with certainty is more than enough to warrant a grand jury investigation. The same family members who called the troopers before called them once again. Only this time, they claim to have a court order from a judge ordering the involuntary detainment of Mary Fulp on mental health grounds. The troopers say they saw this order and it appeared to be a genuine court document, after which point they then proceeded to detain and commit Mary Fulp against her own wishes and in contradiction with their own earlier assessment of her mental fitness. She was detained for 3 days, forced to take powerful psychotropic medications, and was subjected to mockery and ridicule, her career and trust in her ability to lead in tatters. Immediately after the detainment, the Matsu School District sent out an email which indicated that there were reasons to believe Mary could be a danger to the kids and that they were already working on a replacement principal for her. Okay, folks, now get ready for what happened next. Someone in the Alaskan court system evidently either got cold feet because of the growing backlash or heard about the story and realized that there actually was never a court order for her detainment. Mary Fulp was released. The Alaska State Troopers apologized and made the public statement that they acted upon false information and should not have detained her. But wait, it gets even worse. Remember how the Alaska State Troopers claimed they saw a genuine court order? They are now claiming they mistook something else as a genuine court order and will be conducting a, say it with me now, internal investigation into the matter. The court claims that it discovered documents which prove that the court order could not have been genuine, and yet, thanks to the reporting from the Alaska Beacon, we know that the troopers asked the court to see those documents, and the court refused to show them. Whoa, hold up. Not only that, but when the court was asked whether or not this means a family member forged court documents and whether or not charges would be filed, which, it basically implies, and which one would absolutely expect if such a thing were to happen, why they refused to answer those questions too. Now, I want you to just think for a moment. What scenario is more likely? Alaska State Troopers, who see court orders all the time, encountered such a high quality fake that it fooled them, but despite this embarrassment of the troopers, no one knows where the fake came from or how it was made, and no one is being charged for deceiving them. And not only that, but for some reason, the court refuses to show the troopers the proof that the documents could not have been real. For some totally normal and benign reason. Or maybe, just maybe, the court documents were requested by a estranged family and the recently passed law, House Bill 172, naturally David voted against its final passage, that enables exactly this sort of involuntary commitment that everyone warned was going to be used for purposes of political repression, was in fact the rationale employed by the judge. The troopers, who are used to seeing real court orders all the time, correctly recognized it as a real court order, and during the detainment, as a result of the growing community backlash, the court got cold feet and decided that it didn't want to reveal that it does now, in fact, have the power to do what it did, lest widespread public demand for overturning that abuse-prone law develop, in order to keep their newfound powers. Could it be, maybe, just maybe, that in this era of anti-Christian persecution, of state-sponsored genital mutilation of children, of forcing LGBT ideology onto children and the teaching of the rejection of instinct, intuition, and tradition, in this era where local policies are increasingly implemented by those seeking to please far-off globalist policy setters, that maybe Mary Fulp was removed because she would surely have resisted, as in fact had already been happening at Colony in regards to resisting demands for teenage boys and girls' locker rooms and bathrooms coming from the groomer lobby, and that she would have resisted because, unlike the people who pretend to care about children and completely ignore or even celebrate developmentally stunting children with masks or physically and chemically traumatizing child victims of trans ideology, that Mary Fulp would have presented an unacceptable roadblock to uniformity of globalist policy implementation. I mean, hey, it's hard to say. Maybe the troopers really were tricked, and the courts and troopers are feeling generous by not charging the forgers of court documents. And the courts are refusing trooper requests to see the documents which supposedly show it could not have been a court order for some benign reason. Or maybe she was made an example of. To this day, we still do not know the truth, but a real investigation must take place. What a coincidence that the grand jury system in this state has been under such tremendous attack. Do me a favor and type in Alaska Grand Jurors Association into your preferred search engine to see more of what I'm talking about there. Oh, and by the way, the pressure that resulted in her release, the backtracking by the court, and the eventual apology from the troopers, how many representatives do you think spoke up on Mary's behalf before it became evident what was going on? As I said before, just one. And you guessed it, that one man who was on the ball and knew what was going on and spoke up for what was right, regardless of the forces he would be angering by doing so, was David Eastman. He was the singular representative to speak up in the House on behalf of Mary Fulp out of all 40 members. Once again, what a coincidence that Representative Eastman has now, in multiple sessions, repeatedly introduced much needed legislation on the issue of judicial impeachment. Speaking of David, let's get back to him, now leading up to the present day. You know, throughout this video, you've heard about how David consistently opposes being told he must agree how he will vote on an issue or for a candidate for a particular position ahead of time and without full information. Actually, though, it isn't just David who feels this way, though at the moment, David is the only one left in the House still standing strong. In fact, back in 2020, State Senators Mike Showers and Shelley Hughes, along with Representatives Ben Carpenter, Sarah Vance, Colleen Sullivan Leonard, and Sharon Jackson, all joined forces together to present a plan which would do away with the idea of a binding caucus. And not because they're hard to work with or are trying to help the Democrats, but because a binding caucus is a bad idea and hurts the interests of constituents. When the usually vague criticisms of David being, quote, hard to work with are thrown his way, or he is blamed for the failure of Republicans in the House to organize themselves effectively, you will almost never hear, if ever, the phrase binding caucus mentioned. Even then, those unfamiliar with politics might wonder what the big deal is, and at other times think it is only David, being a spoiler, who has a problem with something totally normal and inconsequential. Let me assure you, It is not just David, and it is absolutely consequential. In fact, if it weren't consequential, it wouldn't be insisted upon by the swamp. David is rather the tallest and proudest nail which calls down the wrath of the corrupted hammer. Why are binding caucuses so dangerous? Well, as you may have heard about the current supermajority in the Alaska State Senate, aka the Uniparty, 17 members out of 20 joined together on the condition that they would vote how they were told before seeing the contents of what they were to be voting on. To the credit of the aforementioned Shelley Hughes and Mike Showers, they were not even deemed worthy of invitation to the binding caucus. And to equal or even greater credit, Senator Rob Myers was invited to join but refused to sell out his voters. The only other legislator besides David Eastman to be invited to join a binding caucus type agreement and refused to do so. Meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, a situation not totally dissimilar to the 2018 to 2020 session exists, only this time the Republican leadership is slightly less competent in handling its membership, though still, unfortunately, at least as misguided. Just as in 2018, the GOP won a majority of the seats in the House of Representatives, and just as in 2018, the demand to agree to sign away how a given legislator will vote before seeing the details of what is to be voted on has been made to the House majority membership. Also, like 2018, David Eastman insists upon standing by the interests of his constituents and refuses to agree to sign his vote away in order to, quote, be a team player or easy to work with, which is to say, to make the swamp happy. However, unlike in 2018, this time the GOP legislators didn't break ranks to join with Democrats and form a House majority coalition, at least not many. Now, instead of simply not imposing a binding caucus from the membership, which previously had been said was not going to happen, they have demanded that anyone who wishes to take part in leadership in the legislature must trust the caucus budget process, in quotes. The words are different, but the intent is the same: to ensure complete confidence of legislators' support for passing the budget, regardless of what ends up being in or out of that budget. As a result of David sticking with his principles and by his constituents, he has been excluded from the newly formed bipartisan caucus, effectively making him the last and only Republican legislator remaining in the GOP caucus. Naturally, the Democrat minority won't have David as a member, and David wouldn't exactly be keen on joining them either. Okay, so legislation is still brought to the floor and legislators still vote upon it. Not really a big deal, right? You'd think so, but no. Every legislator has at least two staffers. In David's case, Jared McClure has been with David now for 6 years, and Pam Good had been with him for the past 2 years. With all other Republican legislators spending on perks and hiring additional new staff, there is nothing that compels the legislature to fire any of David's employees, especially employees that have an unblemished job performance. Yet, David's staff were singled out for exactly this treatment. As a man who cares deeply about his people and is loyal to his supporters, being forced to unjustly let a staffer go is already an excruciatingly hard choice. But the petty vengeance of the swamp runs deep indeed, and they did not even have the class to allow David to work it out with his staff which of them was to be fired. Instead, and in violation of the established rules for how legislative employment works, the specific staffer to be fired, Pam Good, was chosen summarily by committee without consulting David. He found out which of his staffers was being fired by an email. This is the petty rage he faces for us on a daily basis. So, what makes binding caucuses so dangerous, and why go to such extreme and petty measures to attack those who refuse to give up their vote? Simply put, in the world of politics, votes for bad legislation which egregiously harm constituents are the sort of thing that can get a politician primaried by someone more interested in listening to the concerns of the voters. On the other hand, in the case of agreeing to vote a certain way ahead of time, this gives corrupt politicians two passes. First, it enables them to say that they didn't have a choice. And in this first option, expect to hear phrases like a budget must be passed. And while this is true, there is no rule that says a bad budget must be supported. And second, when an entire class of legislators vote in lockstep, they feel there is safety inside the herd, and embarrassing questions about why those who voted yes didn't vote no, like, say, a David Eastman might, are avoided. Okay, That explains why politicians who lack courage and principles might be willing to join a binding caucus agreement, but why is it so steadfastly insisted upon by the swamp, despite the chaos it causes and resistance it encounters? Because if special interests really want to do a number on the public and enrich themselves, no politician in their right mind would support an action blatantly opposed to the interests of the vast majority of the public if they had any choice. So, what is a greedy and power hungry so called elite to do in a situation like that? Offer the weak politicians the option of giving up their own ability to even have a choice. As every Alaskan knows, and as many outside the state have no doubt heard about, the PFD is a major issue in Alaskan politics, beloved by the voters and eyed with drooling avarice by special interests. No bill which loots the principal and the yearly dividend from the Alaska Permanent Fund as comprehensively as the swamp wants to loot it would ever pass through the Alaskan state legislature, despite all the tricks and media lies at their disposal. That is, unless a supermajority uniparty composed of members from both parties came together and agreed to sign away their right to decide how to vote, and then all voted on it together. In doing this, the politicians can claim that they had no choice. And even when the voters of many districts see through this obvious excuse, there is no way that all of them will be primaried. And those who are will almost certainly find very cushy and lucrative work with those they enriched through their cutting of the dividend and looting of the principal in order to redirect those funds to be spent in ways that bring business and investments to swamp-owned and operated interests. And that, my friends, is how you steal billions of dollars set aside for the people. As all Alaskans know, over the last few years, much has already been taken out of their pockets in the form of unconstitutional cuts to the PFD. But what most don't know is that it was the invention of the binding caucus that has put the PFD on life support. Time for a little more history. In September 2016, Governor Walker vetoed the PFD. Now, the legislature has the authority to vote to override any veto the governor makes. But they have to do so in a joint session. They can't just do it in the House and then do it later in the Senate or vice versa. So, naturally, as soon as Walker announced his veto, there was a push amongst the pro-PFD legislators to override the governor's veto. Bill Wielechowski led the charge. He made the motion to hold a joint session to vote on the veto. John Coghill said no. Rather than allow the veto on whether or not a joint session would be held, he simply denied Senator Wielechowski's right to call for the vote. He didn't claim any special authority to do so. He just did it, in violation of all that is legislatively holy. Bill challenged him and said, "Hey, you can't do that." And John said, "Well, I just did." Bill then called for a vote on whether you can just violate the rights of a legislator like that. To counter this, John invoked the binding caucus and directed every one of the Republican senators to back him up based on the blank check that they had written to the caucus 2 years before. Uniformity of voting. Even Dunleavy, at the time a state senator, voted to kill the PFD. Why? Because the binding caucus, quote, made him do it. But not just Dunleavy. Every Republican senator killed the ability of legislators to hold a joint session to vote on whether or not to overturn Bill Walker's veto. From there, the PFD was on life support. Now it is comatose. If it is to have any hope of survival at all, the people of Alaska must organize to kill the binding caucus before the binding caucus pulls the plug on the PFD and buries it for good. Maybe now you see just how crucial it is to support David Eastman and why it is he is so hated and targeted. In the end, it's all about money. Of course, the permanent fund dividend is just the most high-profile example, but the same principle applies to other possible legislation, whether it be crime reform, public education, infrastructure spending, fishing, mining, agriculture, gun rights, or any number of other issues at stake of great concern to the average Alaskan voter. Resources and institutions ready to be looted for and accumulated by unelected and unknown groups and individuals operating in the heart of the swamp, and more than likely sent south to Seattle or off to some island tax haven somewhere. By now, I'm sure you're getting the picture of why it is binding caucuses are so dangerous, and why David has always refused to bow to the pressure to submit to them, and why, as a result of his doing so, the attacks and propaganda against him have been so relentless over the years, and also why his constituents return him with a majority of the vote election after election despite the propaganda. The claim that everyone who lives in his district and votes for him is a racist, as swamp operatives like to make, is purely a red herring to distract both from why his constituents support him and why the swamp hates him. Well, this seems like as good a place as any to talk about the latest media kakistocracy plot, which is to say, rule by an alliance between the media and those least suitable to govern, i.e., the most corrupt, self-interested, and spineless. As we have seen from pretty much everything in this video so far, the soulless swamp monsters are relentless. We have to win every time, and they only have to win once. Yet for us, winning means surviving their attacks, surviving long enough for a critical mass of people to wake up to the formulaic patterns of their lies and their true motivations, too large to ever be put back to sleep again. And for them, winning requires the total destruction of any public figure who simultaneously knows, has rapport with the regular people, and disobeys their orders. What this means is David, by his survival, has won every time. And yes, winners often also carry on them the scars of battle. The swamp, in its insatiable lust for power and ill-gotten gain, only becomes more frenzied and with frothing rage after each of its failures to destroy David once and for all. And underneath it all, fueled also by the fear that the failure to destroy him makes them feel, the fear of their dream of total power slipping out of their control at the hands of an organized people awoken to their ways. As we saw before with the failure of Expel Eastman 1.0, then came Expel Eastman 2.0, then 24 signers of a complaint, then the lawsuit against David in the Division of Elections after DOE ruled David eligible to run against that previous complaint, then the AK Purg and Scott Kendall-backed petition for the legislator to expel him after losing the trial, then the firing of half his staff in an act of petty rage. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that they weren't about to stop there. The most recent play, along the very same lines as what has been done stretching back all the way to 2017, with the first dishonest and cowardly censuring, went a little something like this. Pat Martin of Alaska Right to Life sums it up nicely in a recent email where he says, quote, "It took just a couple of hours for the word to get around that Representative Eastman's exchange with the Alaska Children's Trust CEO didn't fit the abortion lobby's narrative, and they've been on the rage ever since. In their efforts to hide the cozy relationship between the abortion lobby and the Children's Trust, they've been distributing heavily edited video that shifts the narrative from protecting children from abuse, and abortion is the worst form of abuse, to vilifying Eastman. The important thing to remember is that David Eastman is nothing special. He simply exposed the hypocrisy of an organization that claims to protect children but is heavily influenced by an industry that profits by killing babies before they are born." End quote. Indeed, well said, Pat. In this exchange, David made a very simple to understand analogy. Given the arguments for abortion are often phrased along the lines of, well, abortion is good because a child might grow up in an abusive household, or abortion is good because it saves young parents money or expenditures on education and social services. David raised the point of the very logical next inference, pointing out the hypocrisy of the abortion lobby, and asked about the savings society would derive from allowing kids in an abusive household to be killed by their parents instead of intervening to prevent the death. After all, this is how non-intervention in killing the preborn is often justified, and David is on record regarding abortion as the worst and ultimate form of child abuse as far back as 2017. Another controversy covered earlier in this video. It is patently obvious to anyone who knows anything about David and his values and politics that he was not advocating for the murder of abused kids to save tax dollars, but rather pointing out the hypocrisy of those who support it for the preborn. Disingenuous operatives and liars are claiming that those to whom David were speaking, Alaska Children's Trust, never used the word abortion, and that abortion wasn't even relevant to the presentation to which David was responding. But if you see anyone say this, I challenge you to actually go and watch the video. In fact, you don't even need to watch the full video unless you want to, because I'll give you the timestamp right here, especially minute 30, but also 42 minutes and 5 seconds in the presentation. ACT presents their latest research on children in the womb. They claim they can evaluate the environment of the child while the child is still in the womb and predict what the child's ACEs score will be at age 3, which is then predictive of work productivity and other measures of success in adulthood. They also presented an average $1.5 million cost to Alaska in the event that any of these children are killed through abuse. David asked them to respond to some of the arguments pro-life legislators often hear that there is an economic benefit to society when unwanted children are aborted, since ACT was arguing the opposite in committee the day prior. They shared with the legislature in their presentation research on preborn children. They used the word preborn at least 15 times. They shared the terrifying research that they are doing to predict what the child's ACE score will be at 3 years old before they are even born, thereby marking Alaskan children for life and potentially some for death, even before they are born. Think about it. ACT was sharing data on how to determine supposedly the economic value of a child, or lack thereof, during a time when that child can legally be killed in the womb. They handed out a brochure, and then David asked his questions. He asked how they calculate this $1.5 million figure. David asked them to respond to the argument that the killed child is an economic benefit, which they themselves argue is the case with unwanted pregnancies. He did not force them to talk about the unborn. He instead forced them to talk about the value they assign to a 6-month-old. He then forced them to talk about the value they assign to a newborn, who is less than a day old. Pretty obvious what the next question was going to be if he'd asked it. They presented their research on preborn Alaskan babies, and David was responding to their presentation with his questions. I'll say it again, and not for the last time. Review the video, and if you see what I'm saying here is true, as you will if you review the video, then you should be aware that every individual and media outlet trying to convince you of the slanderous take on this exchange is at best ignorantly spouting misinformation in order to convince you of a lie, and at worst, intentionally exerting effort to deceive you. Well, you know what happened next, don't you? The swamp rubbed its hands together, called their allies in the media. The media reported that there is an outcry over controversial statements by David Eastman, accepted the false narrative and motivations presented by the manipulatively outraged parties, and showed David asking the question as if he were all about killing abused kids to save money. It shouldn't even need to have been said, but David did, in fact, explicitly clarify, yeah, he does not support such a horrendous thing. But the rule by newspaper headlines kicked into gear once again. And once again, the obedient and terrified fellow legislators, when told to jump, asked, how high? How high has turned out to be yet another censuring, based upon this and an out-of-context photo taken at a museum that supposedly makes David the anti-authoritarian, Holocaust survivor-quoting, sole supporter of the then-excluded single black legislator in the legislature, Sharon Jackson, into a genocide-supporting Nazi. To make the whole situation even more incredible, the Republicans had just recently placed a ban on censuring other Republicans until 2024. But apparently it was designed to protect rhinos from being censured for joining with Democrats, not conservatives. They focused on the Republican Party not censuring the turncoats. How pathetic that the turncoats turned around and are now openly censuring the only remaining member of the House Republican caucus. The party claimed that they didn't need to pass the ban since their old censure, which they did a poor job of enforcing, didn't work. Well, looks like their ban on censoring certainly hasn't worked either. Or maybe it worked exactly as intended. The reason the media feels it can get away with deceiving people like this is because they do not provide the real history of the circumstances and of the individual, which would otherwise alert the people reading the headline or the articles as to the unreasonableness of the claims being made. It is in this way that legislators like David are attacked and made example of for daring to independently stick to principle. And it is in this way that the other legislators are kept in line, along with the general binding caucus trend. It is through moneyed interests, purchasing advertising in media, and donations to corrupt politicians that legislatures are controlled from without, and the influence of the constituents who voted them in stripped away, forming an unholy trinity and a sickly triangle of money changing hands, and wherever possible, looted from the constituents. The media and corrupt politicians work for advertisers and donors to curate the legislature itself, to prevent their rule from being exposed, and to keep the minds of the otherwise uninformed headline readers essentially in a state of enslavement. Yet, they seemingly only have a small number of tricks in their bag that they use over and over. And the pattern with David is to give the guise of proof by citing something out of context, attach disingenuously stated false motivations and intent to his meaning, publicize that interpretation, and make it clear to the others that if they don't join in on the dogpiling, then they will be cast in the light of an Eastman supporter and will be the next to be targeted. The willing servants of this faction, and there are many, can be exemplified by the Kevin McCabe's of the world, as seen with the slimy contrast between his gun rights campaigning and his gun rights voting record, as well as the form of his attacks on David Takes, and standing at the other end of the spectrum, holding up the torch of freedom and taking constant fire on behalf of the completely whittled down faction that represents the people, is David Eastman. Before we get into what this means for the state and ways you can get involved to help to expose the truth and turn the tide, and then close out this video, let's talk about some of those things David actually does support. Anytime you hear me say HB followed by a number, that will be in reference to a House bill David either introduced himself or co-sponsored. All of it publicly available information taken from the legislature's website and also far, far from an exhaustive list. First, consider HB 245 in the 30th legislative session, a bill introduced to help protect the women of Alaska from what was then a growing threat of female genital mutilation, something so-called feminists were, for the most part, shamefully silent about. Likewise, from the same session, consider HB 251, the first but not the last time David attempted to address the badly needed issue of judicial impeachment reform. Or HB 345, a bill highlighting how David sticks his neck out for the little guy, as he so often does, seeking to repeal harmful and unnecessary fees on new tires or certain types of studded tires that fee and regulatory happy liberals are so often eager to impose without consideration of people living on a budget. You've heard about those endless special sessions where the legislature puts itself up in hotels and pays itself fat checks as a reward for its inefficiency through per diem payments. Well, check out HB 371 from the 30th legislative session, where David tried to deal with this issue. From the same legislative session, check out HB 101. And I really think this highlights how he thinks about and represents the little guy, which is yet another reason why he wins re-election. It creates an opportunity for a person who, as a first offense, not understanding hunting laws, unintentionally harvests a big game animal without going through all of the right hoops, and saves them from the large fines involved if they report themselves and don't do it again. I've noticed that the Eastman hates the poor attack has never really stuck, and now you see why. Because David actually thinks about the welfare of others besides himself. In fact, you can bet that is a quiet part of why the swamp hates him too. Speaking of which, let's move on to the 31st legislative session. Consider HB 165, a bill sponsored by David that imposes fines for the overcollection of sales taxes. That's right. The government bodies which tax you more than they say they will would be fined for doing so. Shoot, I probably could have just started the video with that one, and everything else afterwards would have made sense right away. Consider HB 179, David's second attempt at getting the much needed issue of judicial impeachment addressed. This next one I think is brilliant and important. Consider HB 298 in the 31st legislative session, which would establish liability for injuries related to the prohibition of carrying firearms. And you know today this sort of thing is growing more important all the time. Consider his Right to Earn a Living Act, HB 299, which fights on behalf of the working person and small-scale business owner to be as free as possible from excessive government regulation. Again, who cares about this sort of thing? The average person. Who hates it? The big business donors who support regulation to stifle their competition in the first place. And of course, H.R. 6, which, though just a resolution, was co-sponsored by David to stand in affirmative support for the National Native American Veterans Memorial. How about the 32nd legislative session? HB 150 provided immunity from liability for a person exposed to COVID-19 who did not take the jab. On a similar note, HB 275 sought to protect the future of this state, its children, from mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations from being imposed by the state's school system, and not stopping there in his concern for the regular folk, HB 266 came to be known as the Vaccine Consumer Protection Act of 2022. Fighting against barriers to knowledge about vaccines on the market, even if that information is not favorable to the producer. And HB 263 explicitly sought prohibition of mandating the COVID vaccine within the state of Alaska, with HB 262 prohibiting state assets from funding the COVID shot. HB 389 repeals the somewhat Orwellian Real ID Act, something that has never set well with Alaskans. HB 381 helps to secure our election system, streamlines, clarifies, and repeals ranked choice voting ballot measure 2, passed by ballot initiative after what was revealed later to have been an extremely deceptive campaign funded by out-of-state big interest dark money. Once again, showing his dedication to logical and principled compassion, HB 380 provides safety and security to medical professionals who prescribe the very effective and Nobel Prize-winning medication ivermectin from retribution. HB 377, again demonstrating compassion and introduced at the height of the trucker convoy protests, provided outreach to Canadians during those dark times of oppression, and a hand of friendship and invitation. HB 341 called for legislative sessions outside of the literal island state capital, Juneau, to give most other Alaskans the opportunity to see their legislature in action. HB 324 supports the dangerously understudied and relatively unknown history of the crimes committed by communist regimes and their operatives. And tying this all together, HB 327 would make it a crime of bribery for a politician to sign their votes away into a binding caucus. And after what we've already discussed, you can both see why something like this is badly needed and why it is strongly opposed, and why David catches so much hate for it. Once again, this list is far from exhaustive or comprehensive, but it sure does blow the lie that Eastman only votes no and doesn't stand for anything totally out of the water. What exactly does this mean for the future of our state then? And how is all of this related? What does the roundabout on Bogard, David Eastman, and Mary Fulp all have in common? The stark reality is that the policies set by distant globalist decision makers with no ties to the local community or any interests in their lives beyond how they can be exploited and manipulated are rapidly moving closer and closer to the local level and becoming increasingly inflexible as they do so. Leaders across the Western world, all obediently repeating the phrase "Build Back Better," from Trudeau to Boris Johnson to Biden to Nancy Pelosi to Governor Cuomo to the Prime Minister of New Zealand to Prime Minister of Australia, so on to Macron, so on and so forth. is not just merely creepy, unusual, and suspicious, it is indicative of the growing top-down control over our daily lives and local institutions. Distant, predatory, globalist forces are working tirelessly to achieve and aspire to have. As they told us years ago, by 2030 they expect us to own nothing and be happy about it. A binding caucus is a tool of that sort of demand for uniformity at the local level handed out at the top. The attacks upon traditional beliefs and identity, the transformation of what were previously individuals into interchangeable cogs, the stifling of freedom of expression and the indoctrinating of the youth at the local level, and the ability to have those who stand in the way of their plans involuntarily committed and drugged, the corruption and secrecy of the courts in carrying out this agenda, the attacks on the safeguard that the grand jury system in Alaska is supposed to be, and yes, the relentless smearing and misrepresenting of a man who puts his constituents first and would rather see them receive badly needed infrastructure than join a binding caucus which sells them out. All of this is representative of the situation in which we Alaskans find ourselves today. However, as the popular expression goes, if the situation were hopeless, their propaganda would be unnecessary. Their hatred for David and their determination to misrepresent him is so insistent precisely because it takes only one good and courageous person to withstand the onslaught for long enough before eventually observers begin to notice the pattern of what is really going on. And as soon as that happens, and the noticing and comprehending begins to spread, the days of globalist rule are numbered. David Eastman is the indigestible seed of hope in the belly of the beast, and I and others are those observers who notice. And God willing, this video will help more and more see through the lies and propaganda so that the globalist efforts to loot our state and destroy the freedom of our people will come crashing down. As more and more of us notice what is really going on and what is actually fire and what is actually smoke, our numbers, resistance, and effectiveness will grow. We will search high and low for similarly courageous candidates, unwilling to compromise on not compromising us. More candidates sent to Juneau, not to become popular with the swamp, but to make the voice of their districts loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. In spreading this understanding and seeking out and supporting like-minded candidates for every position, from dog catcher to governor and everything in between, the singular seed that is David Eastman will one day find himself standing shoulder to shoulder, as happened on a smaller scale already with Representative Kirka, proving it is possible, with other courageous men and women of integrity. And when that day comes, the whole prospect of looting and oppression facilitated by binding caucuses will come crashing down in a heap. Thus, you, I, those of us listening to this video, we are faced with two choices. We can tune out of politics, perhaps even shut off our brains, and uncritically accept the biased media narratives from sources which have long since lost their credibility and trustworthiness. We can go with the flow like a dead fish downstream, allow our state to be looted, allow our children to be groomed and brainwashed, allow anyone who stands in the way of the march of the globalist agenda to be involuntarily committed and rendered incapable of complaint through involuntary administration of psychotropic drugs. In short, we can choose to allow our state to devolve into a true and genuine dystopia. Or we can seize the opportunity that David Eastman's persistence represents. We can support him, donate to his cause, speak up on his behalf in person and on social media, and most importantly of all, we can choose to come together and turn the tide. We can choose to join forces, collaborate with each other, organize phone banking events, organize candidate searches, until the day when David had to stand alone against the beastly machine becomes a thing of the past, becomes a memory which fills the people with pride and gratitude at what they were able to accomplish and overcome. If you feel as I feel, if you see the dire consequences and circumstances of today for what they are and want to get involved, there are ways you can help. If you live in the Mat-Su Valley, consider attending the School of Government meetings at 7 p.m. every second and fourth Monday of the month at the Real Life Church in Palmer. If you still want to make more of a difference or don't live in the valley, get in touch with the Foundation for Applied Conservative Leadership, or FACL for a class. Look for similarly aware folks on social media. Check out David's website, follow him on Facebook and Twitter, and while you're at it, follow the Fans of Eastman account. Once you've got some local like-minded friends, make it a team-building exercise to find out where and when your local district-level party meetings are held, and start showing up regularly and making your voices heard loud and clear. Make a list of all local offices to which a person can be elected or appointed. Conduct a candidate search for each position with your friends. And then organize phone-banking events and door-knocking days to make sure your candidates get the recognition and exposure they deserve. Show up to the party convention and make sure real conservatives who are involved for the right reasons are elected to key officer and committee positions. Show up to school board meetings. Bring your friends. And if you don't like what you hear at the meetings, start looking for better school board members to replace them. When browsing social media, always remain professional and never let any lie go unchallenged and uncorrected. If you don't think you know anyone locally who fits the description, then be the first courageous member of your own new group. All it takes is a social media account, some conversation, and an agreement to start showing up to local party meetings together to get the ball rolling. Follow Politidic on Twitter and YouTube and any other platform he is on. He is my single most trusted source of news in the whole state, and is therefore constantly shadow banned and suppressed. And Alaska Watchman is great too. Like I said earlier, please look into the good work Alaska Grand Jurors Association is doing. And stay tuned for my next video. Whereas this video was mostly focused on the tip of the anti-corruption spear, David Eastman, the next video will be more broadly focused on the many individual instances of corruption in the state and those anti-corruption warriors and causes calling attention to the looting schemes going on all around us. This advice is far from a comprehensive list, but it is enough to make the difference. Be disciplined and dynamic. Experiment and go with what works. It may seem like the wicked, shadowy forces that seek total control over our politics and lives are too powerful to be defeated and hold all the cards. But the reality is that they have only gotten this far because of their tireless efforts to keep the people demoralized, disconnected from one another, uninformed about what is going on, misled, and uninvolved. It takes their massive war chests and ceaseless propaganda to crawl this far. And their desperate and craven attacks upon David Eastman and Mary Fulp show how absolutely terrified they are of their house of cards collapsing. Yes, it's true. We all have a choice. We can choose to sit things out as everything gets worse and worse, leaving the children of the future puzzled as to why we just let it happen. Or we can make use of the gifts God has granted us, He who helps those who help themselves, and the opening of possibility created by the steadfastness of David Eastman. Organize, fill all the office of the land with the sort of folks we would want to have them, and together drive the forces of globalist tyranny into the sea and out of our state, and save our freedom and cherished way of life for future generations. The choice is yours, and the power is in your hands. As for me, I'll be seeing you where we both belong, on the field of battle.
By insisting he accept their lies as real. By insisting he was never to his people tied. By dictating exactly what he might feel. By permitting haughty joy, but never pride. They believed a lion could be brought to heel. That a lion could from his courage be pride. That the lion himself would learn to kneel. That a lion would not care, even if his line died. That the lion himself would accept such a deal. In the end, it was only to themselves they had lied.